Okay. Good morning. How y'all doing? Okay. My name is Jonathan Mooney, and I'm really excited to spend the day with y'all. Let's dive into it. I was really brought here today to talk about a concept that's percolating in our culture called neurodiversity, which really is a framework that's looking to challenge a lot of the ways that we think about folks with cognitive and physical differences. A framework that's looking to move beyond what's wrong with folks who learn and live differently to really understand and celebrate what's right with them. So a big part of today is going to be about exploring what that concept is, what that concept means, and its implications for you as a parent or as an educator or as a practitioner in whatever setting you find yourself working with the neurodiverse. But beyond that sort of professional agenda, I was brought here today for very personal reasons. I was brought here in some ways to share my story with you all, because my story is a special education story, and my story is a story of the power of seeing a young person through the lens of this diversity framework opposed to a disability framework. So today is going to be a blend of the professional and personal, if that's all right with y'all. It's going to be research-based, but also practical. It's going to be about the science that's challenging the way we think about different brains. And it's also going to be about my story of living with a different brain. So that's a little bit about how we're going to organize our time together. So I'm going to start this morning, frankly, with the personal and not with the professional. Because as I mentioned, I was asked here today to really share my story. So I want to start there. So I want to share my story with you by juxtaposing or comparing two very different educational realities in my life. I want to compare my early education, then I want to fast forward to my higher education, and then I want to spend our first chunk of time together this morning filling in the middle between what will become apparent to you are two extremely different realities. So let me start naturally at the beginning. I grew up in and around Los Angeles, California, and when I was growing up, I was what the folks in my school community lovingly referred to as one of those kids, right? Anyone in the audience know any of those kids? Anyone in the audience have any of those kids at home? Anyone in the audience have a classroom full of those kids? Well, that was me. That was Jonathan Mooney. I was one of those kids who had such a hard time sitting still in elementary school that I grew up chilling out with the janitor in the hallway, right? I was one of those kids who had such a hard time keeping his mouth shut in middle school, always blurting things out, never raising my hand, that I grew up on a first name basis with Shirley, the receptionist, in the principal's office, right? I was one of those kids who had such a hard time learning to read, and specifically a torturous time reading out loud, that I spent all of high school hiding in the bathroom to escape reading out loud with tears streaming down my face. Do y'all know any of those kids? Well, that was me. I was labeled learning disabled or dyslexic in 4th grade. I was labeled ADHD, which stands for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, in 5th grade. And I dropped out of school for a year in 6th grade. That year, when I left school, I had a plan for suicide. When I re-enrolled in school at the age of 14, my freshman year in high school, right here in Denver, Colorado, at Green Mountain High School, right up there in Lakewood, my first day of 9th grade, a guidance counselor called me into his office and said, "Jonathan, I give you a 50-50 chance of graduating from high school. People like you, Jonathan," he said to me, "end up flipping burgers for a living. That's what happens to people like you." When I was 18 and I had graduated from high school pretty much as an athlete, as a soccer player, I'll be honest with y'all, if it wasn't for that one thing that I was good at, I would be a high school dropout today. The researchers call it an island of competency, and it's something I'm going to talk a lot about today, how important those islands of competencies are and how they're quickly disappearing in our schools, how we're not giving young people the opportunity to be good at anything because we're spending all our time with what they're bad at. But if it wasn't for that island, right, I would be a high school dropout today, but I wasn't. I graduated from Green Mountain High School in 1995, and on graduation day, my guidance counselor, who told me I would flip burgers for a living, called me into his office and said, "Jonathan, you would be lucky to flip burgers because people like you end up in jail." So that was the beginning of my educational journey. Now let me fast forward to the end of that journey, because it goes without saying that neither one of those very hopeful prophecies came to pass in my life or in my education. Opposed to being a high school dropout, I graduated in 2000 from Brown University, which you may or may not know is an Ivy League university. I graduated from Brown with an honors degree in, of all things, English literature, right? Opposed to being incarcerated, as was predicted for me, I ended up the author of 2 books, the first of which I wrote as an undergraduate at Brown University at the age of 20. So I have done many, many things in my brief life. I have gone to and graduated from college. I've authored books. I was a national finalist for a Rhodes Scholarship. I have done many, many things with my life, with the exception of flipping burgers or being incarcerated, right? Now, my job today is really to fill in the middle between those 2 extremes, right? My job today is to answer the question that may be in your mind. It's a very valid question. It's a question I'm asked all the time. And that's, Jonathan, how could you possibly go from a 6th grade dropout who could not read at 12 years old? How could you go from that kid to the person in front of us today, right? What changed in your life? What drugs did you take? And where can I buy some, right? I know that is the question in your mind, and I want to dedicate a lot of today to answering that question, right? And the answer to that question is what we'll spend our time with, but I want to give you the short version of that answer, and then we'll dive on in and we'll explore the components of it in more depth. The reality is, I didn't fix myself on this journey. That's what most people assume, right? Most people take a deficit disability paradigm and they say, Jonathan, if you're going to go and live a meaningful life as somebody with a significant disability or difference, you must have fixed yourself, right? You must have cured yourself in some way. That's a rhetorical embodiment of that disability deficit model that thinks that for people to live meaningful lives, they have to cease to be people with differences. But that's not my story. You know, I went to Brown University and I studied English literature, and I didn't fix my reading. I read in the 12th percentile today. Literally, y'all looking at somebody who reads like a 7th grader. I've authored 2 books, right? And I spell at a 3rd grade level. I didn't fix that. I've founded a nonprofit organization that has 30 chapters in 30 states called Project Eye to Eye. And I have the attention span of a gnat, okay? I did not fix myself. So the old paradigm, right? The old disability model didn't hold up for me, right? So what I needed and what made the biggest difference in my life were people who didn't subscribe to that old fix-it model, who didn't subscribe to the belief that if you're going to live a meaningful life as somebody with a difference, you have to cease to be different. The biggest difference in my life came when people adopted that neurodiversity model. That belief that human differences are valuable and important, and that young people with those differences should not be pathologized but celebrated, right? So that's the big picture today, right? How can we, because that's my journey. I went from the kid who hid in the bathroom to the person in front of you because of that paradigm shift. So how can we adopt that paradigm shift? What does it mean to adopt that paradigm shift? And why is that paradigm shift valid? Those are the questions that we're going to explore. And in exploring that, I'm really going to talk about three fundamental commitments that it requires us to adopt that paradigm shift to make. Okay? Three, right? Three. These will organize our time together, meaning we'll take our breaks between these three. So I'm going to pause here, give you an overview of them, then we're going to take the first one and have our first break, okay? Three things a neurodiversity paradigm requires us to understand and adopt. Three. Number one, it requires us to understand that it's not the kid who's broken, but more often than not, the way the kid is treated that's broken, right? And subsequently, if we want to move a young person forward on a journey of change, we have to invest energy in unteaching the way that that young person has been taught to see themselves as a result of living in a system that doesn't celebrate their strengths, gifts, and talents. So that's step one. And we're going to spend our time together before our morning break talking about that shift, right? It's not a broken kid. It's often the way the kid has been treated that's broken, right? Number two, when we come back from our break, we have to make a commitment to moving, when it comes to our educational interventions and systems, away from a deficit framework remediation model to an empowerment model, right? A lot of jargon in there. I'm going to explain that jargon when we dive into it and hang out with it. But a deficit model looks at what's wrong with kids, and an empowerment model looks at what's right with kids. But unfortunately, the core foundation of a special education system and set of interventions is a deficit framework, right? That's not to point a finger at any educators. I had many brilliant special educators who worked in spite of that training. But the core philosophical orientation of much of our interventions is let's fix this kid, right? And I want to challenge that. And I want us to adopt a let's empower this kid mentality. Number three, after lunch we're going to talk about this. We have to understand, in the same vein as moving away from fixing the kid to empowering the kids, we have to understand that research shows us that often the most profound changes we can make are not to the kid themselves, but to the context that surrounds the kid, right? So I'm going to talk about a series of strategic research-based changes you can make to what surrounds kids, what happens to them in their educational and therapeutic environments that lead to better academic outcomes, opposed to our traditional orientation on a set of interventions around the kid. Let's teach spelling, let's teach reading. Research shows that the real change happens when we ask ourselves as educators, how can we do things differently, right? And that's going to be the last thing we talk about before we open it up for some questions and some conversations. So, three big ideas, right? Three of them. It's not a broken kid. It's often what happened to the kid that's the problem. A shift away from deficits and remediation to an empowerment mentality. And number three, a shift away from fixing kids to fixing context. We'll talk about number one, take a break. We'll talk about number two, have lunch. We'll talk about number three, take one more break, and then we'll have an opportunity for some dialogue, some questions, some comments, right? Sound like a good plan? Y'all on board with that? Okay, right on. So let's start with that first one, right? Let's start with that first shift, right? Away from a broken kid to understanding that what young people are often disabled by most is how they were treated, right? And that's really true in my life. You know, a lot of folks come to my story and they like to say, Jonathan, you overcame dyslexia, right? It's a very common thing to say to a young person or an adult who's living a meaningful life with a disability to say that you overcame your disability. But if you reflect on that language for a moment, that implies that the disability was the core problem in my life, right? That's what that language implies. The reality is, in my life, it wasn't dyslexia or ADHD that really disabled me. It was our relationship to those differences that disabled me. Let me say that differently, right? Jonathan Mooney did not overcome dyslexia. Dyslexia is a cognitive difference. It's a positive in some environments, i.e. today, right? It's a negative in other environments. It's a cognitive value-neutral difference. I didn't overcome that value-neutral difference. I didn't overcome dyslexia. What I overcame was dysteachia, okay? That's what I overcame, right? I really did. What I overcame was feeling in school that I was the stupid, that I was the crazy, and I was the lazy kid. I overcame the way that I was treated because of a difference and the identity that I adopted because of that treatment. And what I want to hang out with today is that complicated mix of understanding how I was disabled by the way I was treated and how I had adopted an identity that we had to help me unlearn to move forward, right? There's a lot of interesting research out there about how a young person's mindset is far more important than their skill set, right? In terms of their long-term life trajectories and their long-term employment and academic gains. Mindset matters most. And I know the teachers in the room, y'all have seen that. You know that, right? You've been in front of a classroom, and every kid in that classroom is hooked on phonics, you know what I mean? And you've been in a classroom where there are iPads, right? And you've been in a classroom in which we're doing multimodal instruction, and none of it matters if the kid in the front row feels stupid, crazy, lazy, right? None of it matters, because mindset is often far more important than skill set. So what I want to do now is I want to tell y'all a little bit about the mindsets that I had as a young person that directly stemmed not from my difference per se, but the way that my difference was treated and understood in the context of school. I want to talk about 3 mindsets that I had, okay? And these are me, they are, but I'll be honest with y'all, these are many, many young people that I work with. You know, I've heard these 3 mindsets from young people in all 50 states. I've been lecturing for 11 years. I've heard it from gifted kids, right, who have high school dropout rates greater than kids in special education. Y'all realize that? We're failing kids who are on that end of the spectrum. I've heard it from young people who are in special education programs. I've heard it from so-called normal young people, right? The mindsets of I'm dumb, I'm bad, and I'm lazy, right? They're really common, really common. And they're the mindsets that I had as a kid. And for me to move forward in my life, those mindsets had to be challenged, they had to be untaught, and they had to be understood, right? So what I want to do right now is I want to tell you about that process for me. I want to tell you about where those mindsets came from for me, and I want to tell you about how people in my life, mom, dad, educators, helped me get out of those, okay? Because that's the first step towards change. Because everything else that we talk about later, right? All the interventions that we pursue, if a young person is still stuck in that mindset of being less than, of being stupid, of being bad, none of that stuff is going to move a young person forward. So let's start with the mindset that I had early in my education. Probably the first one that started to emerge for me. And that's the idea that I am the crazy or bad kid, right? And that's a very common one. Very common one for young people on the ADHD continuum. It's very common for young people on the Asperger's or autism continuum. It's very common for young people on the gifted continuum. It's very common for young people who grow up in rough neighborhoods, right? For young people from rough parts of town where there's a lot of conflict, where there's a lot of violence. It's very common for African American young boys to be disproportionately identified as bad or having a conduct disorder, right? Very, very common. So it's a very common mindset that impacts a lot of young people. So the question is, where does it come from, right? What's its origins, right? Because it's not in the kid, it's in a relationship between the kid and the context, you know? So where did it come from? Where did it come from in my life? Well, in my life, it started early. And this is actually really common in the research, if you look at it. I remember my first day of kindergarten, right? First day of kindergarten. I was what? You're like 6 years old in kindergarten, something like that, 5 and a half. And my first day of kindergarten, I went to a half-day kindergarten program. So I was in school for 4 hours. On that first day of kindergarten, after 4 hours in school, my mother picked me up. I got into the car. I turned to my mom and I said, "Mom, why am I the bad kid?" I had been in school for 7 hours and I already thought that I was the bad kid. Where did that come from? A lot of folks answer that "where did that come from" question by assuming that the young person identified bad early in their education has egregiously misbehaved. That's what a lot of people assume, right? They assume that if a kid has been labeled bad in first grade or kindergarten, they've been violent to other kids, right? They assume if a kid has been labeled bad on the first day of kindergarten, they've been disrespectful to authority or something to that effect. But the reality is so much further from that. Research shows, and this was true in my life, that the catalytic event that will start a young person down this cycle of being seen as bad is so trite as almost to be laughable, right? Y'all know what taught me I was bad on that first day of kindergarten, 4 hours in school? You know what it was? Wasn't my relationship to authority. It wasn't violence. What taught me I was bad was the school desk. How in God's name could a school desk teach a 7-year-old child that they are morally defective? How could that happen? Well, guess what? The norm in most of our classrooms is that good kids do what at the school desk? Have compassion for other kids? Nuh-uh. Are kind to other children? Nope. Good kids in school sit still, right? Y'all nailed it. Y'all got it. Reflect on that for a moment. Think about the values that communicates to your children, your students, your nieces and nephews. That is sick, isn't it? We conflate good moral behavior with compliance, right? Not compassion, not kindness, but compliance. And that's a very dangerous idea. And that spoken and unspoken belief has devastating consequences for those non-compliant young people, for those ADHD young people, for those young people on the spectrum, for those young people who come from neighborhoods in which if you're compliant, you're in trouble, right? Where you're not safe. It has dangerous consequences for a whole continuum of kids. Let me immerse you in those consequences through my story, right? This is my experience at the school desk. It's my experience in first grade, 12th grade, Brown University. Today, if you asked me to sit at a desk, this would be my experience. I see that desk, and before I even get in it, my hands start to sweat, right? My face gets all red, because I know after 10 seconds at the desk, what's going to start moving? Trying to be a good kid, and 10 seconds in the class, the foot starts bouncing, right? Well, about 30 seconds in the class, both feet start bouncing, right? What about a minute into class? Oh, I'm going to bust out those drums, right? What about 10 minutes into class, right? 10 minutes into class, it is all over. I'm the kid trying to take his leg and put it behind his neck, all right? And that young person is shamed, aren't they, right? They're shamed. Let's call it what it is. Let's be honest about it, because the unspoken and often spoken norm is that good kids sit still. That good kids are compliant kids. And if you're a non-compliant kid, something must be wrong with you, right? And they're shamed. I was shamed at home by my father, right? I grew up in a good old school Irish Catholic household. And guess what? In my house, good kids, they sat still, right? So the dinner table was a time of shame. The dinner table was, "John, what's wrong with you? Stop it, stop it, stop it, stop it, stop it. What's wrong with you?" From my father, right? And I heard the same thing in my classrooms. Not all my classrooms, but many, be honest with you. I'll never forget, I had a teacher in second grade named Mrs. C. I've had many, many gifted, brilliant teachers in my life that I'm going to celebrate today. Mrs. C was not one of them, okay? my foot would be bouncing, right? My foot would be bouncing. I'd be rocking those drums, and she would stop and stop class, and she would point at me, and all the kids would look at me, and she would say at the top of her lungs, "Jonathan, what is your problem?" Right? Don't get me wrong. I've said that to more kids than I care to remember in my time working with young people. I've never held a job that's been outside of working with young people in 15 years. So I've said that to more young people than I care to remember. I understand that it's a reflex. It's almost like an instinct. But the thing is, when I say to a young person, "What's your problem?" the logical conclusion for that young person is that they have a problem, right? Do you see right there how we've taken a simple human difference like movement and we've made it into a problem? Not a problem with the myth that good kids sit still, but a problem with the kid, right? But the problem really is the myth that good kids sit still. There's a whole host of research out there that shows that many young people, with and without the labels I talked about, many young people move because movement accesses a physical motor memory that facilitates focusing. In plain English, if I don't move, guess what? My brain turns off, right? So it wasn't a problem with me. It was a problem with the outdated belief that good kids sit still, that compliance is what we should cultivate in school. But that belief, which still is strong in our schools, if not stronger nowadays when it comes to test prep and things along those lines, that belief will set into motion a downward spiral which will culminate in me having the public identity of being the bad kid. Because that's the other facet here, right? It's not just that I think I'm the bad kid, but really the mindset gets solidified when the other kids think I'm the bad kid, right? So that's going to be a downward cycle. Let me tell you how we get there for me, right? So Mrs. C says to me, Jonathan, stop bouncing. What is your problem? Stop it. So I want to be a good kid. And in second grade, I want to respect Mrs. C. So I stopped bouncing, right? But then the problem is, I was bouncing because it helped me pay attention. So then my brain turned off, right? So then I spend the rest of the day doing what? Let me put it this way. I spent most of third grade watching the squirrels build a nest, right? And in that moment, I became bad for reason number 2. Because not only do good kids sit still, but good kids also pay attention, right? Y'all realize how we moralize attention span? How we make it a matter of the good kid pays attention and the bad kid doesn't pay attention. So I'm so-called daydreaming and she looks at me and now I'm the bad kid who is willfully not paying attention to her, right? So she's going to respond with the wonderful pedagogical technique, which is research-based, called yelling, right? She's going to say to me, Jonathan, focus, 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 Jonathan. Pay attention, pay attention, pay attention, Jonathan. But the problem is, Mrs. C, I only got one way to pay attention. How do I pay attention? I bounce my foot, right? I bust those drums out, you know? I blurt something out. I move to pay attention. And then in Mrs. C's mind, I've become the defiant kid, right? She told me to sit still and I won't sit still. She told me to pay attention and I won't pay attention. Now I'm moving again. I'm the defiant kid, right? And where does the defiant kid spend the rest of the day? Let's hear them all. Out of them, right? The public settings where I get the social identity of bad. Hallway, principal's office, coat room, back of the room. Anyone in the audience by any chance grow up going to Catholic school? Any Catholic school folks? Okay, we're going to have a separate session when we're all done, right? We're going to have a breakout tomorrow called Nuns with Rulers, right? I'm a good old Irish Catholic. I know all about it. Let me tell y'all my favorite bad kid story, okay? I want to share this with you because I think it embodies the way that we give young people a social identity as bad, which I think most of you know is the final sort of nail in that coffin, right? I mean, when I'm seen by the other kids as the bad kid, that's when I'm going to really own that identity, right? So my best example, my favorite example of the bad kid social identity comes from Green Bay, Wisconsin. And I was there some time ago, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, observing third grade classrooms. And I walked into this one third grade classroom, and when I entered the classroom, I could see in the back of the room a box made out of bookshelves about 3 feet tall. So it's a box about this big. And in one of those boxes, I could see a head bouncing up and down. It was one of the third graders in the box jumping, right? Now that's not a sight, hopefully, that you see every day, you know? So I was taken aback, and I turned to the teacher, gentleman, and I said to him, with all due respect, in my most polite diction, I said, what's up with the box, man? Like, what's going on? I said, what is your behavior modification strategy, right? And the guy did not think that was funny. And he looked at me with all seriousness, not a hint of irony, and said, Jonathan, that's Jack. I said, you have a Jack in the box? Are you kidding me? They put poor little Jack in the back of the room in a box, right? I don't got to belabor the point, you know? If you deviate from this myth that good kids are compliant kids, you find yourself in a box in the back of the room, you find yourself in the hallway, find yourself in the principal's office, wherever you find yourself, you're given this social identity of being bad. And that social identity is very dangerous. I'm sure you've seen it. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because what goes through my head is, well, if I'm the bad kid, I'm going to be the best bad kid you've ever seen. I'm going to run with it, right? There's some power in being the bad kid. There's some agency in being the bad kid. There's a community in being the bad kid. So when a young person gets locked in that cycle, it's a very difficult cycle to get out of. So now that we understand the origins of the cycle, right? The origins of the mindset, what can we do to help a young person get out of that mindset, okay? What can we do, right? And I want to share 3 things with you, some of which I've already briefly alluded to. Number one, we got to find a way to tell young people, the professionals that work with those young people and their parents, that movement is not a problem. That research is unequivocally showing that movement is intrinsically linked to thinking and learning. That we've made a drastic mistake in the way that we've organized our schools. And that we're doubling down on that drastic mistake. I read recently in the New York Times that physical education hours in public schools in America in the form of gym and or research since the implementation of No Child Left Behind have been reduced by 50%. 50%. We're doubling down on the idea that people learn best when they sit still, and it has drastic consequences for all young people. Now I'm going to come back to this when we talk about context change, because I think this is one of the areas that y'all can make the biggest, most practical difference. But right now, for the sake of this mindset conversation, talk to young people, talk to their families, talk to the teachers that surround them. Tell them that movement does not make them bad. It's a valid learning strategy. I had an educator who did that. A guy named Mr. Towner, who I'm going to talk a little bit about later. Guidance counselor up at Green Mountain High School. Saved my life. He said, Jonathan, you move because it helps you think. Go with it, man. That's what he said. Go with it. Channel it, right? Learn how to work with it and accommodate it, opposed to be ashamed of it. And that's a powerful way to help that young person get out of this idea that they're the bad kid. Number 2, we have to think critically and challenge our narrow definition of attention span. Because remember, I was bad not just because I couldn't sit still well, but I was also bad because I was supposedly not making eye contact and paying attention in the classroom. And I say supposedly because we have a very narrow measure of attention, right? Our measure is eye contact, right? That's our measure. We tell kids, if you're making eye contact, you're paying attention. But each and every one of you, y'all know that's a bold-faced lie, don't you, right? You know that's a bold-faced lie. Come on now. How many times have you come home from a long day of work? You've sat down at dinner across from your husband, wife, or partner, making eye contact, not hearing a damn thing they were saying to you, right? Y'all know that's true. Come on now. I'm going to go home tonight after talking with y'all for 5 hours and do the same thing with my wife, right? We've all been there. Eye contact is not a measurement of attention span. So the converse is true as well. For many young people, a lack of eye contact doesn't necessarily mean that they're not paying attention. If Mrs. C, in that classroom setting, if she would have paused for a moment before she said focus or pay attention, if she would have simply asked me, Jonathan, what did I just say? Y'all realize I would have given her every word verbatim. Every word she had said. Plus what Bobby and Janie were doing right here, right? Plus the stain on the carpet over there. Plus the ugly yellow dress in the back. Plus the 5 things she said 5 minutes ago, right? A lack of eye contact doesn't necessarily mean somebody isn't paying attention. We need a more expansive definition of what constitutes paying attention. Many young people who are accused of not paying attention are actually listening to everything being said. Many young people who are accused of not paying attention, if the fluorescent lights were turned off and there were natural lighting in the classroom, they could pay attention just fine. Many young people who are accused of not paying attention pay attention just fine when it's interesting, right? When it's interest-driven, when it's not chalk and talk in the classroom, right? Attention's a multifaceted phenomena. Validate that, expand that, and celebrate that, because it goes a long way to helping me understand that just because I don't make eye contact doesn't mean I'm bad. And last but not least, another way we can help a young person extricate themselves from this mindset of being bad. Another way, right? Validate movement, expand the definition of attention, and number 3, challenge the idea that compliant people are successful people. You know, I don't think our emphasis on compliance in school is nefarious or malicious, always, in its original intention. I do think if folks who are in charge of designing learning environments had an honest conversation with me, they would say, Jonathan, compliant kids are successful kids, right? The kid who can sit still and control themselves and focus for long periods of time make successful adults. And I will grant that historically, for a certain industrial economy, that may have been true, right? You better be able to pull that lever for a long time in the 19th century, you know what I mean? Like, I got that, I'm there. But guess what? The factories are closed. The economy's totally different. We're in a freelance economy. We're in a creative economy. We're in a design-oriented economy. And in that economy, guess what? It ain't the compliant kids who are successful. It's often the non-compliant kids who are successful. There's a high correlation between ADHD and entrepreneurship that I'm going to talk about later, right? There's a high correlation between non-compliant traits like oppositional defiant disorder and running your own business someday, right? So it's changed. And we're doing young people a tremendous disservice to say that compliance equals life success, when the reality is often non-compliance equals life success. Can you have that complicated conversation with your child, your class, with your building, your administration? Because it is challenging the way we think about what traits lead to successful adult lives. My Irish grandmother, she summed it up best, right? Leave it to an Irish woman to celebrate non-compliance, you know? She said it best. When I was having a hard time in school, she said, Jonathan, difficult children make interesting adults, right? And she was right. That should be your mantra, challenging this antiquated belief that successful adult lives are compliant. And that may have been true, but it's not true now in a changed world, in a changed economy. So that's the mindset of bad, right? That's the mindset. It's its origins, a misguided belief that good kids sit still and pay attention. And those are some ideas about how we can help a young person, once we understand its origins, kind of extricate themselves from it, right? So now let's switch gears. Let's talk about another mindset. I frankly think a more devastating mindset than bad. And that's stupid, right? And I say it's more dangerous than bad because there's some upside to bad. There is, right? I mean, there's power, there's agency, there's a community. Many people go into professions like being an artist or being an entrepreneur because they see themselves as anti-authoritarian, right? There's some upside to being bad, a lot of downside, but some upside. But guess what? There ain't no upside to being stupid, now is there? No upside. No upside. And when a young person gets that message and comes to internalize that mindset, it destroys a life. And I think we are at a point where it's a crisis, the number of young people leaving school feeling dumb. You know, young people obviously with cognitive differences, obviously folks who experience special education challenges, but I'll tell you, I've seen this across the country talking to so-called normal kids who leave school feeling dumb. It's a crisis, and it ruins lives. You know, I do a lot of talks in youth prisons to incarcerated young people, and there's always one word that unites the white kids in the room, African American kids in the room, Native American kids in the room, Asian Americans. One word that unites the kids from urban communities, suburban communities, rural communities. One word. Guess what that word is? I'm dumb. Yeah. Every one of them at some point will say in our conversations, I'm stupid. I'm dumb. You know, I gave a talk in Wilmington, Delaware last spring, about a year ago, to 1,000 incarcerated young people, 1,000. 16 to 24, mostly young men of color. And I asked this group of 1,000, who in here felt stupid in school? Who felt stupid in school? And every hand went up. Every single hand. It's a crisis. It is. It's a crisis what we're doing in school, where we call into question a young person's mind, their capacities and intelligences as a human being. So what's the origin of that crisis? I think the crisis has been escalated by misguided public policy like No Child Left Behind, which has narrowed the definition of what constitutes an intelligent, successful human being. There's no question about that. But I think we're naive to assume that the origins of the crisis started with No Child Left Behind, because the reality is, I think No Child Left Behind is just a continuation of a deeply seated and misguided belief about what constitutes intelligence, right? And I think we can sort of sum up that deeply held, misguided belief about intelligence in a couple words, right? And that is this. Smart people, according to this belief, read well. Smarter people read well and early. Smartest people read well, early, and fast, right? We've really invested reading, right? And then the subsequent skills of writing that follow from there as one of the pinnacles of intelligence. We've invested it despite all the research that shows that there are multiple ways to be intelligent, despite all the research that shows that the reading brain is not normal, not natural, but a modern construction, to quote a wonderful neuroscientist at Tufts University named Marianne Wolf, who has documented the fact that our brains were never meant to read. They were meant to speak, but not meant to read. And it's a pretty modern advent, the reading brain, and therefore if you don't have a reading brain, it doesn't mean you're not normal or defective. It just means that your brain didn't adapt that skill set. But we still believe, in the face of all that research about the normality of the non-reading brain, despite the validity of multiple intelligences, we still believe very deeply that the kid who reads is smart, right? And that's what we should be cultivating and nurturing, right? And then we institutionalize that belief. We institutionalize that belief really early in the form of tracks based on who does that well and who doesn't well. Who remembers tracking from when they were growing up? Anybody? Let me ask the question differently, because for better or worse, every one of y'all in this audience, everyone was tracked. Everyone. Who remembers reading groups when they were growing up? Anybody? Yeah, come on now. Those were tracks, weren't they? Was it ever hard to tell which reading group in your school was the smart reading group and which reading group was the stupid reading group? Was it hard to tell? Nuh-uh, right? You got the blackbirds over here. You got the bluebirds over here. And then over in the annexed trailer building, right? You got the sparrows, you know? Come on now. It ain't hard to tell. It's obvious which is the smart group and which is the stupid group. Let me put it this way. When I was growing up, everybody knew that my group was the stupid reading group because my group was a bird that did not fly, okay? It was an ostrich and it ran quickly, you know? And I was hanging out in C-Spot Run all day long reading that. And we all knew that the California Condors were the smart group because the California Condors were reading War and Peace, okay? It ain't hard to tell. Everybody knows it. But perhaps worse than the fact that I know it is guess who else knows it? The other kids know it, right? Some of the worst memories of my life were going over to the other side of the room, right, to pick up C-Spot Run. And let's be honest, C-Spot Run, not a bad book, right? Nice narrative structure, nice moral tale, right? But you don't want to be caught dead with Spot when you're 18 years old, now do you, right? I'm going to put Spot in my shirt, in my backpack, because as I walk by all the other kids, what am I going to hear? I'm here, Jonathan, go back to your stupid reading group. I'm here, Jonathan, go back to your dumb reading group. From the other kids, go back to your retarded reading group, right? I hear that every day. I hear it multiple times a day. And this belief that smart kids read is institutionalized, and then it becomes a part of my social identity. It becomes a part of my social identity because of things like tracking, but then it also becomes a part of my social identity as a result of the multiple moments of public humiliation around that skill set that occur throughout the day for people who don't read well, right? There are many of them, right? There's being the bottom of the hall of great spellers, you know what I mean? There's the reading groups. But perhaps the most devastating is the seemingly benign act of reading out loud. Who remembers reading out loud from they were growing up, right? How many times do we do that throughout the day? We do it 5, we do it 6, we do it 7, we do it 8, a lot, right? From first grade all the way through. Let me immerse you in a reading out loud circle like a kid like me. This is my experience in this circle in first grade. It's my experience in 12th grade. It's my experience at Brown University. Frankly, it's my experience today. If y'all circled up, handed me a book, this would be how I responded. First kid starts to read, right? I am terrified, but I got myself a plan, right? I am going to count the number of sentences that first kid reads, and then I'm going to flip through the book to try to find my paragraph to memorize. Y'all ever seen that before? Right? Often that behavior is misunderstood. Often that behavior is misunderstood as being off task or cheating, right? So I'm yelled at for flipping through the book when the reality is what I'm doing is trying to find my paragraph to pre-read. Because when I pre-read, I don't make as many mistakes. Let me pause right here for a moment. Y'all want to make a difference in the life of a kid like me? In this moment, ask the teacher, or if you're an educator yourself, don't read in a circle, call on kids randomly, and then call on me for a paragraph you gave me in advance, right? How much time did that cost anyone? Nothing. How much lawsuits did we have to go through for that? Nothing, right? Costless accommodation. Give me my paragraph to read beforehand. Because then I don't make as many mistakes, right? But that didn't happen for me, right? So the next kid starts reading. Now I'm in trouble. The first kid read 10 sentences. The second kid is reading 20 sentences. I can't find my paragraph, right? I don't know what page I'm going to have to read. Now the panic attack starts, right? The hands start to sweat, the throat chokes up, the words are all over the page. It's a full-blown anxiety attack. Then the kid right next to me starts to read. I'm next. I raise my hand. Where am I going? I'm going to the bathroom, right? Raise my hand, march myself into that bathroom. I'm in the bathroom praying to God that when I come back from the bathroom, I will be passed up, I will be skipped, but lo and behold, surprise, surprise, I come back from the bathroom only to discover that they They waited for me, right? They held my book, they gave it to me, and I read. Well, I didn't really read. Nuh-uh. Read would be an ambitious term now, wouldn't it, right? I stumble over every word, every sentence, every paragraph, every page for 15 or 20 minutes sometimes. And that's first grade, that's 12th grade, right? That's multiple times throughout the day. And what I learned there, and what my peers learned there, is that smart kids read. And if you don't read well, you ain't one of those smart kids. You're dumb. And that has devastating consequences, right? So what can we do about that? That's the question, right? So that's the origin of the mindset that I'm dumb. It stems from a very narrow definition of what constitutes intelligence. So what can we do about that for a young person? And I will give you some ideas about that, okay? 3. Number 1, we have to take seriously the validity of multiple intelligences. We have to take that seriously. We have to celebrate those different ways of being intelligent, but we have to celebrate those different ways of being intelligent that don't just have an application to academics, right? Because often what happens with our rhetoric or our multiple intelligences is we're all good with an intelligence as long as it's an efficiency to better test scores, right? So let's teach spelling through interpretive dance, you know what I mean? Right on, right? It's an efficiency, you know? Wrong. We got to celebrate those intelligences that don't have direct application to academics. You know, some of the smartest people I've ever met in my life, they didn't read well, they didn't write well, they didn't spell well, but they could rebuild that car engine from scratch. And that person should feel celebrated in school, right? You know, I worked with this young man named Robert back at Brown about 12 years ago or so. First kid I ever worked with. And Robert had the horrible label of mentally retarded. That's the official label that they used in Providence, Rhode Island school system, right? So everyone thought Robert had no intelligence. I go to school with Robert one day, and I see Robert in his first period, when he enters the class, go around to every one of his classmates and give them a hug. Robert did that every single day, every class. Robert wasn't dumb. Robert had the emotional intelligence of Jesus, right? Robert had the spiritual IQ of Gandhi, you know? It wasn't going to raise any test scores, but we need that in our world more than ever, right? We have to celebrate those multiple manifestations. But we can't just celebrate it rhetorically. And here's my challenge for you all, right? We can't just celebrate it rhetorically. Y'all know what I see all the time? I see well-intentioned schools, classrooms that want to celebrate differences. They want to say that we're all special snowflakes, you know? But then there's no meat on those bones. There's no change to practice. So they tell every kid in first grade that they're special snowflakes, and then the bell rings, and that turns into, now sit your special snowflake ass down. I will tell you what to think, when to think, and how to think, you special snowflake, right? Gotta have some meat on those bones now, don't we? It can't just be rhetoric, it has to be practice. We need to preserve those places in our schools where multiple intelligences thrived and were cultivated, right? Those places are the shop class, which we have cut exponentially in this misguided drive that every kid must go to college, right? Those places are the art classes. Those are the places where multiple intelligence are nurtured, are built, and are celebrated. It can't just be rhetoric. It's got to be practice. It's got to be places in our schools, times in people's day where they get to really be celebrated for that different way of being. So we got to take multiple intelligences seriously. And that means talking about it, but it also means making it real in the world. Number 2, we need a different paradigm for intelligence. Multiple intelligences was a seismic shift in the way we thought about intelligence, from a single entity to a portfolio of skills. But there's another, perhaps more important, if it could be, or equally as important shift occurring in the research literature, and that is understanding that intelligence is not an entity but a process, right? And this is work that's really been done by Carol Dweck, originally out of Teachers College, but now out of Stanford University. Understanding and documenting how intelligence is not an entity, but a process. Let me explain that distinction, right? For the longest time, we thought about intelligence as an entity like height, right? Not much you can do about your height, you know what I mean? Like, not much you can do. You can improve your diet, ain't going to change your height all that much, right? You can work out, ain't going to change your height all that much. It's a fixed entity, and we used to think about intelligence that way, right? You got it, or you don't. And subsequently, schools gave up on those who they determined didn't have it, right? So they invested in those that did, right? But all the research is showing that intelligence ain't like height. It's more like strength, right? It's a process, right? Strength is something that, yes, there are fixed parameters to it, right? Jonathan Mooney can only get so strong, but nonetheless, I can always get stronger, can I? Each and every one of you can always get stronger. You can't get taller, ain't going to happen for you. Hate to break it to you, right? But you can get stronger. So intelligence is a dynamic process. It's like a muscle. And if we invest in those muscles, if we invest in challenging kids, in telling them that it is a process, not an entity, they can get stronger when it comes to their minds. And a lot of that goes back to the work of mindset. And that's actually a term that Carol Dweck coined at Columbia's Teachers College. Many young people have the mindset that their intelligence is a fixed entity, so they don't try. But when they adopt the mindset that they can get stronger, that they can grow, there's exponential possibilities for them. Last but not least, when it comes to intelligence. So we have the idea that it's multiple. We got to make it real. We got the idea that it's a process and not an entity. And last but not least, we have to help young people understand, related to that process idea, that there's validity in neurological late blooming, okay? Now, many of y'all, I'm sure, have said this to your children, to your grandchildren, to your classroom. You've said that people grow and do things at different times. You have said that. I know you have, right? My grandmother said that to me. My mom said that to me. My mom read a book to me every morning called Leo the Late Bloomer, right? It's about a lion that can't do things, grows later in life. It's for second graders, but my mom read that book to me every morning. I was 18 years old, right? Because she believed that people do it at different times. And that's been something we've intuitively known, but now I'll tell you, science is telling you the same thing. Quote from a research study, quote, research study from McGill University and the National Institute of Health. ADHD is not a deficit, but a maturation delay. It's a late blooming brain. That research was on the front page of the New York Times 3 years ago. There's exponential research out there showing that the dyslexic brain is a late blooming brain. There's amazing research that shows that the Asperger's autistic brain is a late blooming brain. Not that deficits go away, but that young people become more capable of managing and accommodating those deficits as their brains grow larger, right? People are putting the growth continuum for the ADHD dyslexic brain mid-20s. Not done growing until the mid-20s, right? It's an amazing thing. It's a hopeful thing, isn't it? It's related to that idea of intelligence and your mind not being a fixed entity but a dynamic process. It's hopeful because no one can ever predict my capacities, but school is all about predicting capacities. And it's about predicting capacities earlier and earlier. One of them, except guess who? Little Max Mooney, right? Not walking, not crawling. All that kid could do is roll, right? Roll, 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 roll. And don't get me wrong, kid was a damn good roller, right? Kid could roll like no other. But I was filled with fear, you know what I mean? Filled with fear. And I turned to the the facilitator of the group, wonderful woman. And I said, look, lady, not a nice thing to say, but nonetheless, I said, look, if my kid rolls to high school, they will put him on that short bus, right? Where's the anti-rolling medication, you know? Where's the OT, right? Get this kid walking today. And she laughed at me and she said, you know, kids do things at their own time. And guess what? She was right. You know, you ever seen the kid that doesn't walk at 18, you know what I mean? You know, that doesn't have a significant physical disability? Kids do things at different times. And we need to be elastic, and we need to celebrate that, right? And we need to embrace that. And there's hope in that. You know, there's a cliche, a truism in the discipline of biology. And the truism is this: the most complex organisms take the longest to grow. The more complex the organism, the longer its growth continuum. These are very complex brains. They're beautiful brains. They're brains that have tremendous gifts and talents. And often they're late blooming brains. And to hear that from you, to talk about that directly to a young person makes a huge difference. But to have a dialogue with your system about the consequences of that research is the systems change step, isn't it? Because what passes as academic rigor in many schools is we take the 6th grade curriculum and we make it for 3rd graders. And we make the 3rd grader curriculum and we take it for 1st graders. And we take the 1st grade curriculum and we make it for kindergartners, right? We are acting in a developmentally inappropriate way. That's often directly the opposite of the research around how brains grow, how kids learn. So that's a conversation you should push in your community. So that's the mindset of me being the dumb kid. That's some ideas about where it comes from, what we can do about it. Now we got one more mindset. Then we're going to take a break, okay? One more. Because remember what I said was mindsets for me were stupid, crazy or bad. And then lastly, lazy, right? Big one. Whew, I do a lot of work as a consultant in Los Angeles, trying to develop post-secondary pathways for at-risk young people. Young people who have experienced school failure, who have been labeled at risk, young people with disabilities, but young people who need support in making that next step in their life. And what I hear all the time when I go to many of these collaboration meetings, whether it be from Voc Rehab or whether it be from tradition counselors or whether it be from parents, a kid, adolescent with a disability or cognitive difference, I hear all the time the kid's lazy, right? We like to put it on the kid, you know what I mean? We like to say that if that kid just bucked up and worked harder, right, their life would be better. They are lazy. Now, I don't buy laziness. I really don't. I think that is a misdiagnosis. And like any misdiagnosis, if you're not understanding the root of the phenomena in front of you, you're not going to take actions that address the problem, right? So let me encourage you to think about the root of the phenomena that appears as laziness differently, okay? And understand its origins and then talk about what we can do about it, right? Let's talk about that for a moment. Because I don't buy laziness, I don't. I believe two things are actually underneath laziness, two other phenomena that it's important to understand. Number one is the phenomena of intrinsic motivation. And number two is the phenomena of learned helplessness. Two are related. And we need to understand their relation to understand laziness and appropriately diagnose what you see in front of you. So let's start with intrinsic motivation. Because I often believe that a young person who appears lazy or is labeled lazy or accused of laziness is often somebody who is simply motivated differently, right? Whose drivers as a human being are different than the drivers of the institutions surrounding him or her. There's really two camps when it comes to the research on human motivation. Two bodies of knowledge that essentially say that human beings can be motivated either externally or intrinsically, right? Externally motivated people, according to the research, what they're motivated by are a fear of punishments, a desire for rewards, or praise, right? Those are their motivators. They don't want to get punished, they want the reward, and they want to be praised. Now, it's not a great leap of logic to understand that school is an externally motivated model, right? We got the gold stars and we got the detention, right? And we believe that in that system of sticks and carrots, young people will be motivated, right? And frankly, many people are motivated externally, and it works for some young people. I'll be honest with y'all, I don't think it works for as many young people as school likes to claim it does. There are many young people who, once they get out of the stick-carrot world, don't know what to do with themselves, you know? I went to Brown University and I saw that every single day. I saw young people who were motivated by the gold stars, SAT scores. They got to Brown University, those were gone, the parents were gone, and the first thing they did was they bought a bong, right? And they stuffed $35,000 a year in that thing and lit it on fire, right? Because they didn't know what to do with themselves when they were outside of a stick-carrot environment. But some people are motivated that way. But then there are others. And these, I think, are your sons and daughters, your clients, your students. These people don't care about sticks and carrots. They are intrinsically motivated. Intrinsically motivated folks, what they care about is autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Those are their drivers. Not punishment, reward, or praise, but autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And when those drivers are present in the relationship, in the institution, a seemingly unmotivated young person often becomes exceptionally motivated, right? I'm sure y'all have seen it in your own life, in your own practice as an educator. You've seen the kid who can't sit still for 5 minutes in the classroom, right? But goes home and rebuilds the car engine for 5 weeks because it's their project, that's autonomous. It's purposeful, they want that car, and it's masterful. It's something they are good at, right? And the seemingly unmotivated young person becomes a very motivated young person, right? Best example I've ever seen of that came from a father and a son after one of my talks, right? Give a lot of talks to parents, and after this talk, where I talked about the difference in motivation, a father came up to me, and it's always the dad when it comes to lazy, now isn't it, right? Dad comes up to me and says, "Jonathan, I heard what you said about motivation, but you're wrong. My son is lazy. My son is lazy." And I said, "Okay, sir, I want to understand your perception, your point of view. What makes your son lazy?" And he proceeded to tell me about a very, very unmotivated, one would say lazy young person during the school week, right? Kid wouldn't get out of bed, kid wouldn't turn things in, very unmotivated during the school week. And then I asked him about the weekend. If you got a seemingly lazy kid, always ask about the weekend, right? And we always ignore that. We think that a kid's life is the school week, and we ignore their behavior on the weekend. Ask about the weekend. So I asked this man, "Okay, that's cool. What happens Friday night?" And he said, "Well, Friday night, my son goes in his room, and he's pretty much there all weekend till Sunday night." And I said, "What's he doing in his room?" And he said, "My son's on his computer, lazy kid on his computer." And I said, "Well, what's he doing on his computer?" And he said, "My son, now that you ask me, he's building a video game." Building a video game? Lazy kid. Well, what's he doing with that video game? He's selling it on the internet, right? This kid, from Friday night to Sunday night, was spending 18 hours a day, he was labeled Asperger's, building a video game that he was selling to his friends. He subsequently designed a video game sharing program like Napster, but for video games, where kids could trade games, that he sold when he was 18 years old to a video game design firm for $4 million, right? Lazy? Nah. Intrinsically motivated, right? That's where you push this conversation with a young person. Because that young person, that young man with Asperger's, he thought he was lazy. No one ever said to him, no, dude, you are intrinsically motivated, man. You can build your life on that, right? And that's a revelation for a young person to hear that. That doesn't mean that I don't struggle with motivation in the externally motivated world. Let's not be naive about that. We have to have an honest conversation about that. I do struggle with motivation when those drivers aren't there. But that means I'm unmotivated, not lazy. Big difference, isn't it, right? Big difference. Lazy is a moral diagnosis. It's a moral condemnation. Unmotivated is a statement of fact. And it's contextual, right? I can be unmotivated here, but super motivated here. And that's what I'm going to learn from, and that's what I'm going to build my life on. But unfortunately, to go to the other concept underneath laziness before we take our break, in a world and school system of sticks and carrots, of rewards and punishments, the intrinsically motivated person doesn't get the reward, doesn't get the praise. What do they get? They get the punishments, right? So in that world where they're punished all the time, the intrinsically motivated person learns a psychological phenomena called learned helplessness, right? And we need to understand that. Because many young people, as they think about transition into adult life, they're going to be struggling with that learned behavior. So learned helplessness is a term that came from the research of Martin Seligman out of Cornell University. He's now at University of Pennsylvania Center for Positive Psychology. He really is the grandfather of the field of positive psychology, looking at how do we cultivate positive traits like resiliency in people. But his initial research was about what happens when all the experience of somebody or something is punishment. What happens? So this initial research in the 1960s helped us understand the phenomena of learned helplessness and coined the term. The original research had an experiment like this, where they built a cage, right? They put a fence in the middle of the cage. They put an electric shock on one side of the fence. They put an electric shock on the other side of the fence, and then they proceeded to put a monkey in the cage. And the experiment had 2 stages, okay? 2 stages. Remember, what happens to an organism in pain? Stage 1, they shocked it on one side of the fence. It hurt. It jumped over to the other side. Natural response. It was safe for a while. A day, 2 days. Then they shocked it on the other side. It hurt. It jumped over to escape the pain. It was safe for a while. That's stage 1 of the experiment. Then there's stage 2. Stage 2, the researchers turn both the shockers on. So wherever the animal goes, it hurts. There's no safe place in the experiment. That reminds me of school. That reminds me of being an intrinsically motivated person who doesn't get rewards but punishment all day long. Let me explain the analogy, right? I go to school in the morning. My foot starts bouncing. John, hallway, first shock. Like the monkey, I jump over. I go out to the playground, and I'm teased on the playground. John, what's wrong with you? You're a spaz. You're a freak by my friends. Another shock, and I jump over. And then I go home. And at home, I face my father, who would say things like, Jonathan, I will not have a retard in my family. Buck up, work harder, man. I face verbal abuse. Many young people face physical abuse. They face neighborhoods that aren't safe. They face not enough food on the table, right? But their home or community environment hurts. So when that happens, it hurts in the major life spheres. It hurts academically in school. It hurts socially with friends. And it hurts in the family or community sphere as well. When that happens, all the shockers are on, like the experiment with the monkey. The question is, what happens to an organism in pain? What happens to that monkey? Now, there's a lot of right answers. A lot of right answers, right? The animal will become angry, right? Become angry. That's a natural response to pain. Anyone in the room ever worked with an angry young person, right? It comes from somewhere, right? It's a valid response when it hurts all the time. The animal would become depressed or withdrawn, right? It's a natural response to pain. It saps energy. Animal stops eating. I struggled with depression growing up myself. The animal will attempt to escape the experiment, right? tries to jump out of the cage. Natural response to pain. Y'all have seen the multifaceted ways that young people attempt to escape pain by dropping out of school, by hiding under the bed, by abusing substances, all things I did myself. But ultimately, what happens to the animal after anger attempts to escape and depression, before it dies, can't live in pain all the time, it will die. Before it dies, it gives up. It stops trying to jump back and forth. It's a psychological phenomenon known as learned helplessness, right? But unfortunately, when I'm a kid who's laid down like the monkey in middle school, high school, I'm not understood through the lens of learned helplessness. I'm understood as lazy. You see how lazy is a complete misdiagnosis, right? Often the kid accused of being lazy is putting out more energy in one day of school than most kids put out all year, right? Often the kid who's accused of being lazy is the intrinsically motivated kid who will rebuild the car engine all weekend if it's autonomous, masterful, and purposeful, right? But right there, I'm accused of being lazy, when the reality is I've learned helplessness. Now, there's hope in that shift. There's hope in that shift because unlike laziness, which is a moral flaw, a moral diagnosis, learned helplessness is learned behavior, and learned behavior can be unlearned, right? With the help of an adult, with the help of a teacher, with the help of a parent. And that's a hopeful phenomenon, right? And the path towards unlearning that helplessness is to turn a shocker off in a kid's life, to make it hurt less, to understand that intrinsic motivation should be brought in to a school setting. Choice programs, when young people have the ability to choose parts of their day, show exponential retention and completion rates versus prescribed programs. Because young people are motivated when they choose a part of their day or a part of their activity. Last but not least, we have to help young people make that shift away from being lazy to somebody who's intrinsically motivated, who may have learned helplessness, but now who can unlearn it. And that shift to unteaching learned helplessness, that's why I want to break this morning. Because when we come back from our break, I'm going to talk about the path forward with that, right? I'm going to talk about how do we help a young person unlearn that helplessness. And that path forward is grounded in the belief that we should not spend so much time trying to fix kids, but we should adopt an empowerment model, right? An empowerment model that has a research base to it and has a set of specific practices or changes that I'm going to tell y'all about when we come back from our break. I want to do one piece of housekeeping before we embark on the part 2 of our conversation. And I would like to give out my email address. I know some of y'all may decide to join another session after lunch, or some of y'all may have obligations after lunch. You may not come back, so I want to give it out now, just in case you're one of those folks who has something other to do this afternoon and you miss it. So I'll give it out a few times, but I'll definitely give it out now in case you're calling it a day after this this segment, which I completely understand, by the way. You know, I tell my wife people listen to me talk for 4 hours. She does not believe it, you know, at all. So you can use this email to email her directly and tell her that, right? So my email is pretty simple. It's my name. I will. I can do that one. Lowercase, one word, Jonathan Mooney, which is JONATHAN, and it's MOONEY. So it's Jonathan Mooney, one word, lowercase, at me, which is me.com. Jonathan Mooney at me.com. While we're at it, we might as well give out a website. It's got some resources on it. Some of the research I talked about today, general framework of the presentation, etc., as well as a speaking schedule if you all want to come visit me somewhere else. It's just my name, same spelling, one word, lowercase, .com. So JonathanMooney.com. One more announcement, in case folks are departing after this. I've been asked in the break, how do we take this message home in a variety of different ways. So there's a few ways to do that. I was speaking to a woman in the back. There's never been an organization who has asked me to come speak for whom I haven't been able to accommodate, as long as they are flexible and accommodating as well. I do a significant number of free presentations a year, today being one of those, because I support Pete's work tremendously, believe in Barb's Buswell and her work. I do a number of these a year. They book up very quickly. Very quickly. Do a number of significantly reduced fee stuff, again, book up quickly. So right. But as I said, there's never been a group who said, look, we're willing to do it in a year, we're flexible, come, we want it to happen, who I've never been able to accommodate. If that doesn't work for you, you don't represent an institution, you don't have time, etc., there are 2 videotapes. I believe both of which are here today, I'm not sure, but they're certainly on my website. Ways to kind of bring the message home. One's called What the Silenced Say. That is my story. No research, very little framework, designed to show to young people. The kid that thinks they're stupid, crazy, lazy, and has a limited vision for their future. The idea was that maybe my story could give them a different sense of their horizons. And then there's a long one that really was actually shot here at Peak in a comparable format a couple years ago, extended day, called Teaching and Learning Outside the Lines. And that's today. It's always a little different, but it's the general framework. So if you kind of left today being like, hey, I wish my staff was here. It's broken into 45-minute chunks. You can show a little bit. You can see the whole thing. It's on the website as well. And then lastly, 2 books. Here today at Peak, and I really encourage you to buy them from Peak. All the profit goes to Peak if you do so. I've donated the books to them for that. It's a fundraiser for them. So I really believe in that, this organization, as I've mentioned, called Learning Outside the Lines. Learning Outside the Lines. It's co-authored with my good friend David Cole. Been out for about 11 years, which is frightening to say. And a book called The Short Bus. The Short Bus. A Journey Beyond Normal. It's a memoir of growing up, physically and metaphorically, on the short bus. And that's here today, and all of the profits from that go to Peak. So if you're interested in those, don't do Amazon, do it here if you can. It's a wonderful organization. So enough of the shameless product promotion, right? Oh, wow. And as per our agreement, you will get some revenue from that, okay? I will honor it. I appreciate that. Thank you. I appreciate the soft sales pitch from the audience. I love it. Enough of that. Let's dive on in. We got about 50 minutes before our lunch break. Remind you where we are in this journey. The question we're trying to answer is, how do you go from a 6th grade dropout to an Ivy League English major if you didn't fix yourself? And the answer to that question is, folks in my life adopted a neurodiversity or diversity paradigm to understand my experience. And what it means to adopt that as a parent, professional, institution, teacher, is to take mindset very seriously and to understand that it's not the kid that's broken, it's often the way that they've been treated that's broken, and subsequently the way that they've come to see themselves. And we spent the morning talking about that. Spent the morning talking about the origins of stupid, crazy, lazy, and some strategies to help a young person extricate themselves from that mindset. But there were 3 other elements we were going to talk about today, right? That was one. We're also going to talk about the importance of a shift from a deficit remediation paradigm to an empowerment model. And then we were going to talk about the shift from a fix the kid model to a fix the environment model, right? So that means that for the next 50 minutes, we're going to tackle the second part of that, which is that paradigm shift from remediation and deficits to empowerment and strengths, gifts, and talents. We're going to go to lunch. We're going to come on back from lunch. We're going to talk about some strategies to change the context that surrounds young people. And then we're going to open up for some dialogue. So that's a little signposting for where we're at and where we're going. So let's dive into that second component, this empowerment component. Because I really do think that this is both a monumental philosophical conversation. I think it's a monumental institutional conversation. And then I think it's a monumental shift in our investments and practices when it comes to young people. So I want to frame a little bit what a radical shift it is, though it sounds simple, but what a radical shift it is to say that we need to move away from a deficit remediation approach and belief system to an empowerment model. And then after we talk a little bit about what that shift is, why it's valid from a research perspective, I want to tell you about people in my life who put empowerment in practice and give you some ideas about what empowerment in practice could look like for you as a parent, as a teacher, or as an administrator. So let's start with that first piece here. The idea of understanding what a monumental shift it is. To say we don't need to fix kids so much. Because it really is the core component of a special education model is a fix-it model. It's the core component of a deficit disability model. That these people have problems, and these problems should be fixed. And there are many who go so far as to say these problems should be cured. Some I'm going to come back to. That if we could rid the world of dyslexia and ADHD and autism and all these differences, we should. Because these are unequivocal problems. And I'm going to address that in my conclusion today, because I don't think these are problematic brains, but I think these are brains that have a lot of value to add to human society and human culture. But that belief that we got to fix them, that's our job, is really solidly entrenched. And challenging that belief has sort of profound impacts. And I think the best way to understand the impact of challenging that belief is to understand that impact for me, right? Because my road forward academically, as I said, was not in my remediation. I don't spell well, I don't read well, I don't pay attention well. Those things were not fixed in my life. They weren't, period. For me, the road forward was really that empowerment approach. And it's really embodied by a commitment that my mother and teachers in my life made. And I want to dramatize that for a second because I think it helps us understand how that shift can really change a life. And for me, the tension between remediation and empowerment and the importance of choosing the latter was really brought to the forefront of my life when it came to Fridays in elementary school, right? Fridays in elementary school, what you talking about, right? Fridays in elementary school. What often occurs on Fridays in elementary school? What often occurs, right? Spelling test day, right? You got it, man. Not pizza party day, you know? Not free Friday, right? But spelling test day. That was the regime in my school. Spelling test day every single Friday. And everything that led up to that test, that Friday, embodies a remediation model in my life, right? All of it does. Because I would get my words on Monday, right? On Monday. And I would do like 5 hours of flashcards to get those words in, right? Fix the spelling. Then on Tuesday, with the same words, I would do 5 hours of drawing them in the sand, right? And then on Wednesday, I would do 5 hours of building the words with blocks, right? And then on Thursday, I would do 5 hours of interpretive dance to get the words in, right? And what happened? Every single Friday, I failed that test, right? Every single Friday. No matter how much we tried to fix, it didn't move me forward in my life. So one Friday, about 2 months into third grade, my mother decided that from that day forward, every Friday, me and her would ditch school and go to the zoo, right? Every single Friday. And I was asked by the USA Today in 2000 when they did an article on learning outside the lines. I was asked by the USA Today, Jonathan, one word, how did you get to Brown University? And I said, the zoo, right? Because right then in that moment, we made a commitment to not fixing me all the time. We gave me, my mother, and other teachers came on board and supported that later. We made a commitment to telling me, you're not broken, right? And that's the heart of it, isn't it? You know, what research shows is that a deficit orientation and a remediation regime in which we've identified the deficits and organized a young person's time to solely fix those deficits, that it leads to a young person adopting a patient mentality and a mentality of being a flawed, broken human being. Now that is problematic for so many reasons. You know, young people should not, no young person should go through their life and school experience feeling broken, right? They shouldn't. But it's exceptionally problematic when you really start to look at the emerging research on what traits lead to life success, right? What traits lead to life success? Life success defined not by making a lot of money, not by going to a fancy school, but by having a decent living wage job, having relationships, and being able to be in your community. That's life success for me, right? What traits lead to life success? Well, the traits, according to research, that lead to life success are resiliency, efficacy, and agency. Can you repeat that again? Resiliency, efficacy, agency. The problem is, when a kid feels broken and adopts a patient mentality, that view of themselves is the opposite of resiliency, agency, and efficacy, right? The Greek root for the word patient, where the word comes from in our language, is to be flat on your back. It's the most disempowered place a human being can ever be in. It's a place robbed of agency and of efficacy. And the research is showing that young people in special education experiences who go through a deficit remediation regime, they score the lowest, and I quote from a research study, out of any group on agency and efficacy scale. The lowest. But these traits correlate the highest with life success, right? We're not adopting a paradigm that builds young people's agency, resiliency, and efficacy. And that is the heart of an empowerment model. An empowerment model wakes up every day and says, how do we build that triad of traits? Not because we're all touchy-feely, but because research shows that young people who live successful adult lives score high on all three of those traits. They may not score high on IQ, not a good predictor of life success. Y'all realize that? IQ is a terrible predictor of life success according to the research. They don't necessarily score high on basic skills, right? Look at me, spell at a third grade level. They don't score high on grades. Grades, by the way, are a terrible predictor of life success. It's a cliche that the C students end up running the Fortune 500 companies. They're not good predictors of life success, period. Resiliency, agency, and efficacy are good predictors of life success. Let me give you a research study around that, okay? Because I know we want to put some meat on the bones, not just Jonathan saying this. Give you a wonderful one that embodies it. Then we'll talk about how we cultivate those traits. A wonderful social scientist out of the University of Chicago. And y'all can find this research popularized in a book called Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. It's not Malcolm Gladwell's research. None of it is, right? It's her research, but you can find it there if you're interested in the source, right? So this researcher, social scientist at the University of Chicago, studied 1,000 low-income young people in Southside. Young people, about 25% of whom had labels of disabilities, but all of them were at risk or marginalized. And she studied them for an extensive amount of time, from essentially 4th grade to their post-secondary transition. And she wanted to answer the question that I think most people want to know, which is what makes the difference between the kids who go this way towards a meaningful adult life and the kids who go this way to become a statistic, a dropout on the school-to-prison pipeline, etc. And she discovered a number of variables that attribute which kids go down the right path, but one variable she discovered surprised her most. Do you know what one of the best predictors of life success was in this control group? It's amazing. The number of questions a child asked their doctor. That's an amazing, it's pretty specific, right? The number of questions a child asked their doctor. Now, what she extrapolated from that was multifaceted. One, if a kid is engaged in their health care, they have better life outcomes. That's obvious. But the subtle distinction she extrapolated from that was that young people who questioned professionals thought of themselves as agents. They thought about themselves as people who had a right to question this man, usually a man, white man usually, in a lab coat. They had a right. They had enough sense of self and self-worth and agency to say, you know what, this is my life, you know what I mean? This is my body. I'm going to ask you questions that I need to know. And that agency rating became one of the best predictors of which kids beat the statistics and which didn't. So we want to cultivate resiliency, efficacy, and agency, which I put under the heading of we want to empower young people. And that's how we get there. So the question is, what does a commitment to empowerment look like for you? For you as a mom, dad, grandmother, for you as an educator, for you as an administrator, what does a commitment to empowerment look like for you? We understand the distinction between deficits and empowerment. We understand it's research-based. What does it look like in practice, okay? And I want to talk about 4 things. 4. I'll tell you about 4, okay? When I wake up every day and say I want my sons, Max and Leo, to be a part of an empowerment experience at my house, I think of these 4 things. When I wake up every day as somebody who designs programs for at-risk youth to move them forward, I think about these 4 things. So I think these are things you can bring to whatever context you represent here today. Number one. If you look at the young people, like that, those young people in the study who ask questions of their doctor, if you look at young people like myself who went on a journey of change, at the center of that journey of change will always be an advocate in their life. Period. Frostag Center out of Pasadena, one of the most reputable sort of schools and research institutions around the issue of learning disabilities and diversity, did a longitudinal study of kids with significant learning disabilities from childhood to adulthood. What makes the difference? Across the board, the ones who were successful in their adult life had advocates in their life and learned from those advocates self-advocacy behavior, period. It was by far the single most important skill set they could learn. And that's true for me. You know, I'm here not because of the reading class, not because of the handwriting class. I'm here because of Colleen Mooney, right? That's who I'm here because of. An advocate in my life, right? Give you a mental image of my mom, right? My mother, a lot of folks underestimated her as an advocate. And it ain't easy to be an advocate as a parent, as a foster parent, as a grandma. It's a hard thing to do. And my mother faced that. You know, give you a mental image of my mom. You know, my mother, she was underestimated because she was not a tall woman. On a good day, in high heels, she was like 4'11", you know? Little Irish bulldog, right? My mother was underestimated because she was not an educated woman. She raised my brothers and 2 sisters on welfare in San Francisco. Mother never went to college. And my mother was underestimated because she had a high-pitched, squeaky voice like Mickey Mouse, right? Very high-pitched, very squeaky. But folks underestimated her at their own peril because she wasn't educated, she wasn't tall, and she had a strange high-pitched voice like Mickey Mouse, but my mother cursed like a truck driver, right? She did. And I'll ask you a question. If you were a principal or a teacher, did you want cursing Mickey Mouse in your office, right? And the answer to that question, if you're confused, is no, okay? But guess where Colleen Mooney was every single day when things weren't going right for her son? She was in that office. How do we know she was in that office? Because every dog in the neighborhood was running away, right? Only bats could hear her high-pitched obscenities, you know? Glass was shattering, you know? My mother advocated for me. And my mother realized that what I needed was not somebody to fix me first and foremost, but somebody to fight for me and with me. That is a fundamental paradigm shift, though. Because I know that so many of y'all, as moms and dads, and as teachers, are told that your job is to fix the kids in front of you. It's a very different model to say my job is to fight for the kids in front of me. Whether that's as a mom, or whether that's as a teacher. You know, educators can play an advocacy role. Educators can help young people navigate the complex systems that surround them. Educators can help young people understand their rights. Educators can help young people have a voice in this process. They can be advocates. And what my mother knew, and what I learned from her, and what the research tells us is I don't need somebody to fix me, I need somebody to fight for me and with me. And that's a commitment that you and your system and the collaboration that surrounds the children you care about has to make, right? So what does it mean for you or your system to make that commitment to advocacy? What does that mean, right? Number one, it means that we have to think about the relationship between families and schools as a partnership, and that's a two-way street. That's a two-way street, right? It's a two-way street. I'll be the first to admit to you, I love my mother dearly, but my mother had some anger management issues, right? She would show up to that school with the guns blazing, right? That ain't necessarily the best way to build partnership, but it's a two-way street, because sometimes my mother would come to those meetings and she would hear, Colleen, you should take a parenting class, right? Or Colleen, you know, if the kid is broken, the family must be broken, right? It's a two-way street. And it requires both of us to understand that this is a partnership and that we need to relate to each other. We need to build relationships that are respectful and are working together to move this forward for a young person. It also requires that we reframe the IEP experience, right? The IEP experience, which I think most of us will admit is a procedural paperwork experience at this point, has the potential to become a laboratory for self-advocacy. It has the potential for this to be a practice space for a young person to know what it's like to share their school experience, to know what it's like to have adults listen to him or her, to know what it's like to run a meeting about themselves. Every one of us should have the goal that young people who have IEPs or 504 plans run their meetings by the time they leave high school. If they can't do it here, how can they do it when they're adults? I mean, we need to prep young people for that and let them practice it. And what it also means to take self-advocacy seriously is that we acknowledge that it's a skill. And like any other skill, not only does it need to be practiced in the IEP setting, but it needs to be taught, right? If we're going to take it seriously, let's teach it. We take reading seriously and we teach it. We take writing seriously and we teach it. We need to take self-advocacy development seriously and we need to teach it. We need to have it valued all the way up to the school board level. We need to have it valued by principals. We need a curriculum to develop it and cultivate it. And I'll be honest with you, this is one of those rare win-wins, because this is relevant certainly to young people with labels, with disabilities, but it's relevant to every single young person in a school. Agency and efficacy highly correlates with life success for all kids, not just kids with disabilities. Let's practice it and let's teach it, right? Because I'm here today, as I said, not because I remediated my spelling, not because I developed my writing skills. I'm here today because of my mother, because of cursing Mickey Mouse, right? Who committed herself to fighting for me. And each and every one of you can make that commitment and can be that advocate, right? So that's the foundation for empowerment. It's more important than anything else I'm going to say right now, right? It is the single most important skill set you can cultivate. Be an advocate and teach self-advocacy behavior. But there's a couple more. As we think about cultivating empowerment, advocacy is the most important first step, but there are others. There's a second step. Number 2, when we think about what builds resiliency, and when we think about the educational research that shows what educational and therapeutic interventions make the biggest difference, we are often way off the mark about what we think about. You know, there's a wonderful study from Harvard University. One of the definitive studies on resiliency, right? And it's a study like these others I mentioned that tracked young people over a longitudinal period, significant amount, wanting to answer the question, what interventions for these young people built resiliency? Because resilient young people are successful adults. And across the board, do you know what this research study determined? That the number one thing every single resilient individual had in common, the number one intervention, was that they all had one meaningful adult other than their immediate family in their life. And 95% of the time, guess who that meaningful adult was? It was a teacher. It was a school counselor. It was a social worker. It was a principal. It was a custodian. It was a school person, right? 95% of the time, it was one of you. That's an amazing statistic. It didn't take 5 meaningful adults, not 5. It did not take 4. It did not take 3. It did not take 2. It took one meaningful adult to build resiliency and lay the platform for in successful adult life. That challenges the investment that we're making in education now, doesn't it? Because I believe we have a discourse in education that believes it's not people who make a difference in the classroom, but the products and the pedagogy and the things that we do around kids, right? There's a belief in our country that if every kid had a laptop, there'd be no more poverty. You know what I mean? It's not the books. It's not the classroom. It's not the administration. It's not the pedagogy or the approach, to be honest with you. The determining element in the classroom are the people who are there, period. And we should invest in teachers. Imagine for a moment if Los Angeles USD, the second largest school system in America, took 10% of what they pay for new textbooks every year and hired more teachers with it. It would transform our school system. We need to invest in people because they're the determining factor, right? And that's an important insight for you as a parent, isn't it? Because I'll tell you, as parents, there are many folks out there saying, no. Invest your money in this product that's going to fix your kids. Invest your money in this reading program that's going to change outcomes. Invest your money in this behavioral modification approach. And not that those aren't valid, but the core investment is in relationships with meaningful adults. So if that's the platform of empowerment, it raises another very important question. What do those meaningful adults do to become that meaningful adult, right? So if you're sitting here in the room saying, you know what, I want to be that meaningful adult for the kids in my class. Or if you're sitting here saying, you know what, I manage a bunch of adults, what do they need to do to be that person? Or if you're a parent saying, you know what, how do I evaluate the professionals in my kid's life? We have to answer that question. Research shows us that meaningful adults really do 3 things. 3 things, okay? They're good at 3 things. Number 1, this ain't going to come as a surprise to anyone. Meaningful adults are connectors and relationship builders. Period. Period. You know, there's a wonderful study that the RAND Corporation did out of Los Angeles, which is a think tank. And it's a study related to a controversy that's occurring and occurred in Los Angeles, where the LA Times published, I don't know if y'all followed this at all, they published the rankings of teachers in elementary schools in Los Angeles from number 1, the most effective, to number 3,000, the least effective. Based on a very controversial statistical analysis called value add. Looking at what value does this teacher add in academic outcomes? Now, it's very contentious. No one should ever be publicly shamed. But what wasn't reported in this story is Rand's findings about what the effective teachers had in common, right? You know what they found, looking at those effective teachers? They found that those effective teachers were all over the map on style, which is really important, right? You know, some of them were old school, chalk and talk. Some of them were flamboyant, really talkative. They were all over the map. The effective teachers were all over the map on pedagogy. This is really important. I myself have hung my hat on, if everyone was multimodal in the classroom, everything would be better. You know what? The research shows that pedagogy is not the determining element in the classroom. The effective teachers, some of them were old school, they were just talking. Some of them were doing interpretive dance, right? The teachers who were effective were all over the map on experience. That's really interesting, right? And education, you know? Some of them were emergency credentials. Some of them were alternative credentials. Some of them had PhDs. We like to believe if everyone went to school, our schools would be better. Not necessarily true, right? What they weren't all over the map on is the most important variable, and that's connection. The effective teachers connected with kids, period. The same holds true in other therapeutic environments. There's a very famous study about the efficacy of different psychotherapeutic approaches, right? Jungian versus Freudian versus response to intervention. And do you know what the study shows? Methodology is irrelevant. Rapport is central. Did the person in the room get along with the kid in front of them, right? It's about connection. Think of the meaningful adults in your life who mattered, right? Remember them. Think about them. The first one for me was Mr. Rosenbaum, Mr. R. I remember everything about this guy, right? I remember where I sat in his class. I remember who sat next to me. But I do not remember a damn thing he taught me, right? I don't remember any of it, you know what I mean? I remember the connection. I remember the man stood in the front of the class, and every morning when we came in, he said, "How are you?" to every single kid. And when we left, he asked how their day was. Every single kid, every single time. He took the time to build a relationship with me, right? And that's something we should reward in teachers, and we're not. We're not measuring it, we're not holding them accountable for it, and we should. And we should celebrate that, because that connection matters most. I'll tell you, connection is more important than a teacher's ability to know content, right? We used to think of teachers as administrators of content, but technology has killed that, right? If you're a teacher in the room here, who thinks they know more history facts than the iPhone in my pocket, right? Who thinks they're a better speller than that iPad I got in my bag, right? Who thinks they can deliver a better social studies lecture than the PhD from Harvard who I can download for free on iTunes University and play for y'all right now? Content ain't king anymore. It's dispersed. It's connection. The classroom of the future is a connected classroom where educators are building relationships with young people and then help them navigate and facilitate that content, right? It's all about connection, right? So what else do effective teachers do, right? They do more. They connect, but that's not the end of it. After they connect, they also build an alliance. And that is specifically true in research around at-risk young people who are experiencing school failure, i.e. many of the young people y'all care about. They become the person on their side, right? That is so important, you know? It's so important. I told you about that teacher, Mr. R. He would ask every kid when he left that day, how was their day? And 90% of the time when an adult asks a kid how their day was, do they really want to know the answer? No, right? They want the kid to look at them and in the best diction say, I am overjoyed, right? To be in trigonometry, you know, at 7:30 in the morning, right? We ask these kids and we don't want to hear, right? But Mr. R, I remember he would ask me, and many days I would look at him and I would say, Mr. R, school sucks for me, man. I'm not doing too damn well. And was I lying? No. And Mr. R's response made all the difference. He didn't call the school psychiatrist and get me diagnosed oppositional defiant disorder, you know? He didn't kick me out. He didn't say, watch your mouth. You know what he said to me? He said, you're right. That's an alliance builder right there, you know? How often do we tell kids that they shouldn't have the feelings they have? All the time. I love school. It's great that we're taking a standardized test, right? Love, you know, we tell kids they shouldn't have the feelings they have, and subsequently they don't think of us as on their side. They don't think of us as having an alliance together. You want to be in us, not a them. And young people who experience school failure, I will tell you in the research, unequivocally a tipping point in their life is when they decide to prove the them wrong. You will hear that in every single journey, right? They made a decision at some point to prove them wrong. And that decision was often facilitated by an educator who built an alliance with them, who said to them, you know what, I'm on your side. Those folks had low expectations for you. Prove them wrong. You know, that was a tipping point in my life. I'll share it with you. You know, I went to, out of Green Mountain High School, I went to a 4-year college in Los Angeles called Lila Marymount University before I transferred to Brown. And I went there just to be a soccer player, to play ball. I thought I was just a dumb jock, right? But I always had these interests in literature and storytelling. So when I got to LMU, I went to the English department, right? And I went on a tour of it. And I went into the office of this old school Jesuit priest professor named Father Young, because Lila Marymount's a Jesuit institution. One of the last Jesuits still there. And he was a Shakespeare professor. And I sat down in his office and I said, you know, I'm really thinking about being an English major here. You know, what do you think? And he said, look, son, if you're passionate about stories, you can do it. So the next day, I went to my counselor, my dean, to talk about what I would major at in LMU. And I sat across from this guy who had all my testing in my file in front of him. And I said, you know, I think I'm going to study English literature. I talked to this professor, Father Young, and he said I could do it. I think I'm going to study English literature. And the guy looked at me, and then he laughed at me. And he said, English literature? No, you can't read. You can't write. You should consider something less intellectual, right? So I had a choice to make, right? What do I do, you know? So I went back to Father Young, and I said, Father Young, man, you know, this guy told me, you know, I really couldn't do this. And Father Young looked at me, and in a way, only an old school Jesuit could. He said, prove that bastard wrong. and the next day I enrolled in 4 English literature classes, and that dean counselor has an autographed copy of both of my books sitting on his desk right now, right? Because Father Young was an us, you know what I mean? He was an us. And he helped me find a them. And he personified the them. I'm going to be crass for a moment. You know, you got a young person who's trying to go on a journey of change, you should find a Mrs. C, you know? And you should personify that person. Make that person real. And you need to build an alliance. And then you need to tell them that they need to prove the thems wrong. And that's what meaningful adults do. And lastly, the meaningful adults, according to research, right? They're connectors. They're alliance builders. And then lastly, they're folks who have exceedingly high expectations for the young people in front of them. You know, I don't go around quoting former President George W. Bush all that often. That may not come as a surprise to you. But he got it right when he said there's a soft bigotry of low expectations for many young people in many of our schools. There are this belief that intelligence is an entity that you can't change, when the reality is it's a process. And meaningful adults hold people to the highest standards possible as a sign of respect and belief in their capacities, right? That was Father Young, you know? I went back after I enrolled in English classes and I said, okay, Father Young, man, I'm ready for your class. And it was day 1 of a Shakespeare class. And he said to me, okay, Jonathan, here's King Lear. And you need to read it by Monday. And it was a Friday. And I said, Monday? The rest of the class has a week. And he said, so, you know, you can do this. You have until Monday. No one ever did that before with me, you know? No one ever said, you can do better than the other kids. No one ever said that to me, right? Often when I was a kid in a special education program, they'd hand me a book, and they would say, you only got to read a page of this book, right? Or they'd hand me a book, and they'd say, well, if you fall asleep on the book, that's good enough, right? You know, like in osmosis, you know what I mean? Like, no one ever said, hey, no, man, hey, let's do this. So I said, Father Young, man, I don't read well. And he said, I didn't say you had to read the play. That's the brilliance of Father Young. Hey, man, go watch it. Here's a book on tape. Listen to it. High expectations with strategies to reach those expectations. Not about a product, not about a program, not about a book, but it's about people. And it's about those meaningful adults who do those 3 things. Okay, we're talking about empowerment, remember? 4 things you got to keep in mind. Advocacy, right? You want to empower somebody, you become an advocate, you cultivate that behavior. Number 2, you invest in people. And you invest in people who connect and affiliate and hold high expectations. And number 3, you make a commitment to competency and strength development. We've circled around that all day. Let's call it what it is. It is the antithesis to an investment only in what's wrong with kids. It's a belief that we should scale what's right with kids. And that's a huge tension in schools. Not just in special education experiences where most of the time is oriented around what's wrong, but it's a huge tension in school in general, because I think school is built on the model of the generalist, right? It's built on the idea that we should be generalists across the board. But the problem is that the schools are preparing generalists for a world of, guess what? Specialists, right? More and more, research is showing that successful adults are not good at all things. They're good at 1 or 2 things. Howard Gardner said it best. Howard Gardner said, school, and I quote, is the only place where you're asked to be good at all things. You get out of school and you ain't asked to be good at all things. You build your life on scaling your strengths. And if we asked ourselves what it means to take that seriously in a school or special education setting, it requires us to do things much differently. And that requirement is supported by a whole host of research. I want to give you one right now. There's a wonderful study about Fortune 500 CEOs, right? Because CEOs are folks who we usually think of as Renaissance generalists. We think about them as men and women who are good at everything, right? Wrong. The Forbes magazine study showed that CEOs of Fortune 500 companies in America have peaks and valleys in their skill sets, right? That they are exceptionally good at some things and absolutely terrible at other things, right? Terrible. So what do? They do what we all do to varying degrees. And that is, they mitigate their weaknesses through accommodations, modifications, and support, right? And they scale their strengths. Now I was asked by a young person once, and I'm asked this question a lot. Jonathan Mooney, how did you get successful, you know? How could you write books if you don't read and write well? And I said, you know what? I married my spell checker, right? We all do it. It's called strategic mating, you know? And if you haven't done it, you should try it, right? We all enter into partnerships and relationships in which our strengths and talents are compensated, right? And are scaled and are complementary. But we don't let kids do it, right? We tell kids, you got to be good at everything, right? When the reality is, you don't got to be good at everything to be successful nowadays. You got to get good at something, you know? Something, one thing, right? Build on that, you know? But unfortunately, the research shows that to get good at something, you got to do it a lot. 10,000 hours is the statistic. To get good at something, you got to do it for 10,000 hours. But kids like me don't get 10,000 hours of scale and strength. We get 10,000 hours of remediating weakness. You know, I would have been a good debater, don't y'all think? Would have been all right at debate, you know? Like, would have been okay at it. But Jonathan Mooney didn't get to go to debate camp in the summer. Jonathan Mooney went to phonics camp in the summer, right? We spent our hours, and there's precious few of them, investing in remediating weakness opposed to scaling strength. So a commitment to a strength and capacity program and model means that you have to carve out time in people's day to build those strengths. We talked about it before. We talked about the disappearing islands of competencies out there. The gym class that's closed down for more test prep. The arts class that's closed down for more tutoring. The shop class that's decimated. The state of California, since 2000 to 2010, reduced funding for vocational education by 50% to focus on core academics. 50%. They're disappearing islands of competencies. Get them back. Fight for them, right? But also, that's the big picture. There's a little picture here. If you're a mom or a dad, don't just go to that tutoring class after school. Go to something that's interesting to a kid that may be an opportunity to find a talent, find a strength. If you're an educator, even within a flawed system, you can still dedicate time within your classroom to talk about talent, to expose kids to what they might be good at, and to invest in where that might take them. And that latter piece requires us as a community, as a school system, to understand that there are multiple pathways to a successful adult life, and not all of them require college, right? We're making a big mistake. And I really believe that. You know, there's this whole discourse here that the only successful life is a college-educated life, right? 7 out of the 10 fastest growing professions in America, 7 out of 10 do not require a BA to get those jobs, period. They require some post-secondary training, a certificate, something to that extent, but they don't require college. There are multiple ways to live a successful adult life, and we have to give young people the opportunity to find that talent and scale that talent. Let me give you the best example I've ever seen of that in my work with young people. You know, in Los Angeles, I developed career pathways for low-income, at-risk youth of color, many of whom have disabilities, into meaningful adult lives, living wage careers. And one of the first young people I ever worked with was a young man named Juan. And Juan had been incarcerated when he was 13 for running a 50-person drug ring in LA. He was a serious narcotics dealer. And he went to jail, he served his time, and he wanted to do something different. So he came to our meeting saying, look, I want to do something different. What I did was wrong, but I am dumb, he said. He grew up in special education, dyslexic guy. And he said, I have no skills, zero. I am not good at anything. I looked at Juan and I said, Juan, 50-person drug ring. I said, you're an entrepreneur, brother. I mean, I said, Juan, you know, let's be honest, man. We got to get you a different product, you know? Like, we got to get you some stocks or some sneakers or something, right? So, but man, right there, dude, right there. Hey, we can work on that. How often have you seen that? How often have you seen talent misapplied, right? How often have you seen it misunderstood, you know? And I said, Juan, we can work with that, man. And Juan was enrolled in a career pathway that was called the Urban Arts Crew, which helped young people who have artistic skills become designers, put them on a pathway to get the professional certificates to be freelance designers, and then connect them with internship and employment opportunities. It took a year to do this. This kid read at a 3rd grade level, but he could paint and draw like no one else. At the end of that year, Juan incorporated his own freelance graphic design business that last year in this economy had profit, not revenue, but profit of $500,000, okay? Because we scaled his strengths opposed to remediating his weaknesses. And that's a fundamental component of empowerment. So I got one more. One more. I'm going to go through this quick because if I've learned one thing as a public speaker, do not stand in the way of lunch, right? I got it. I'm there with it. Got one more. Empowerment, right? It's about an advocate. It's about a meaningful adult. It's about opportunities to scale and invest in strength. And last but not least, it's about a commitment and an investment in building a sense of community amongst young people who learn and live differently. You know, when you grow up in a special ed setting, you think you're broken, and you hide your difference from everyone else. But there's nothing as empowering as realizing you're not alone and you're not broken. And having a sense of community and affiliation with folks who've gone on the same journey. And that's a story that's true across the board for other marginalized minority groups, whether it be folks of different colors, different genders, whether it be folks of different sexualities. That community building component has been essential to that group advancing economically and educationally, a sense of not being alone. You know, and that played a huge role for me in my life. You know, when I went to Brown, I thought I had no place there at all, right? Here I am, a kid who didn't learn to read until he was 12, dumb jock, thought I had no place at Brown. And I remember my first day at Brown, we had an orientation in which we all had to go around, because I transferred there, and share where we transferred from and what we did the summer before. And it's Brown University, right? I waited tables the summer before I went to Brown, right? So a kid raises his hand and says, you know, I transferred from Harvard, and I worked at the National Institute of Health over the summer. And I'm literally like, I am packing my bags. I'm leaving. Next kid raises his hand and says, you know, I transferred from Yale, and I'm on a short list for a Nobel Prize, right? And I'm out of here, man, done. Then this guy raises his hand, and he had purple hair, and he had bicycle chains around his wrists, like bracelets. And he said, my name is David Cole, and I transferred from Landmark College, which is a 2-year college for kids with learning disabilities and ADHD. And I worked construction last summer. I'm like, that's my boy right there, man. And David Cole became the co-author of Running Outside the Lines. We wrote that book together. The first person I ever felt connected to and not alone with when it came to being somebody with a neurodiversity. And that sense of community was essential to my path moving forward. And it's something y'all can build. It's something you can do. Bring in role models of people. Bring in these stories. You know? But it's not role models, not famous people who matter most. It's real people who build community, you know? It doesn't do me any good to hear that Whoopi Goldberg's dyslexic. That's all well and good. She's too far away. Doesn't do me any good to hear that Tom Cruise is dyslexic, right? Or was until Scientology cured him, right? That doesn't mean anything to me. What matters to me is a guy like Dave. You know, what matters to me is a 9th grader who spends an hour a week with a 3rd grader. Or a 12th grader who spends an hour a week with a 9th grader. Project II is a nonprofit I created that creates these mentoring networks as a conduit to community building. But y'all don't got to be a part of Project II. You can do that yourself. A commitment in building community and relationships is the ultimate commitment to empowerment. Because in a community of people like me, I don't feel alone, I don't feel broken, I don't feel defective, I feel like an agent in the world. So that's empowerment. You know, it's a commitment to moving away from what's wrong to kids to celebrating what's right. And empowerment changes lives. But it only changes lives within the context of our last point of conversation, which we'll talk about after lunch, which is a commitment to changing some of our practices that surround kids. What do we got left to cover? Again, you'll remember, today is about what made a difference in my life, how I went from a kid who could have been a statistic, and the statistics are terrible, of young people who come from my background. About 65% will never graduate from high school. The prison population, about 80% folks with cognitive differences. The unemployment rate for folks with cognitive and physical differences is the worst out of any specific population in this country, period. So I very easily could have been one of those statistics, and I wasn't. And today was about exploring what's the tipping point for me in my life, to use an overused phrase. And I started the day saying that a framework that saw me through the lens of diversity opposed to disability was an essential part of changing my life outcomes. And that for us to take that diversity framework seriously, it required us to take mindset seriously and understand it's not kids who are broken, but often the way they're treated. It required us to make a shift from deficits and remediation to empowerment and strength. And that's what we talked about right before our lunch break. And now you'll recall I said there was one more component. And that's what I want to spend the next 45 minutes or so talking about. And that is a commitment which extends logically from the shift from remediation to empowerment, that we need to be investing our energy not in trying to fix kids, but trying to change what happens around kids. You know, a belief that change to the environment, to the context, to the classroom is really where the impact occurs, where we can really move folks forward in their life. So I want to flesh out a little bit the validity of that shift, right? Why is that a valid thing to say? And then I want to identify some areas where I think you can make some changes tomorrow or Monday when you come back from this conference, and really make some practical changes to what happens around kids. So let me start with that first part. Why is this a valid shift to make? I want to talk about both some experience and some research here, but I want to start with some experience, because I think all of us know, and we've had experiences with the fact that a trait can become good or bad depending upon the environment that trait is in. We've all seen that before, right? I think I started this morning with a perfect example. Jonathan Mooney has a dyslexic brain, right? Dyslexia, from my perspective, is value neutral, if not a net positive. But it becomes disabled by the context that it's in. So if Jonathan Mooney had to write everything that I just said as a term of the environment, I'm disabled. I have a significant problem. I experience shame and humiliation. But in this context, where Jonathan Mooney doesn't have to write it but can say it, the same trait becomes an asset opposed to a liability. We've all seen that happen, haven't we? The way that a trait's value is really contextual. You know, I think we all have experiences with that. But I want to give you what I've seen is probably one of the most profound and hopeful examples of that I have ever seen. You know, I'm writing this new book about the neurodiversity revolution, because I think it is a revolution. I think it's a revolution in the way that we think about the human mind. I think it's a revolution in the way that we think about what brains are valuable. So I'm exploring the ideas, concepts, and research around this neurodiversity revolution. And my exploration of this took me to an amazing place. And if y'all haven't heard about it, you should know it. You can visit it. And it's in Finland, okay? It is a software design company that only hires computer programmers with Asperger's or autism. That is their entire business model. It's not a charity. I want to be very clear about this. It's not a sheltered workshop. It's not a do-gooder thing. It's not run by the government. It is a business. And it makes sense, right? They believe that the Asperger's autism spectrum mind is better at the job of computer programming than the so-called normal mind. They also believe that they're a more productive workforce, and that makes a lot of sense. They don't waste a lot of time on chit-chat, right? Not a lot of office cooler banter, you know what I mean? And that makes sense. And I wanted to visit this place that has essentially said, this mind is the opposite of deficient, it's actually valuable to me. And it was a real lesson in the way that context determines the value of a trait. So I went over there and I visited, and they were very generous and gracious. And I had a chance to visit the plant and watch people at work and talk to the programmers. And at the end of my visit there, they were generous enough to host a reception or cocktail party, right? For myself and all of the programmers. And I will tell you, if you have never been to a cocktail party with 100 computer programmers with Asperger's, you have never lived, right? Missed it. You missed the boat. Okay? So I go to this cocktail party, and it's amazing and very generous. And about halfway through the cocktail party, and they all speak Finnish, you should know that. And I have an interpreter as a guide. And not many folks speak English, except for the interpreter. So halfway through the cocktail party, I notice a group of programmers over on the other side of the room talking about me, right? Y'all been there before, haven't you? You know what I mean? Like, you know somebody or a group of people, they're talking about you, and you can tell, even if it's in Finnish, right? You know. You can tell, you know? So I know that these dudes over here, they are talking about me. So I turned to my host, and I said, hey man, what are they saying about me? And he said, oh, nothing, don't worry about it, polite. And I said, look man, I'm a big boy, I can handle it. I'm here to learn. and I said, tell me, what are they saying about me? And he looked at me and he said, well, they think you're weird, right? And you know what? In their world, I was. And it was a visual and tangible experience about how what traits we consider normal are entirely contextual, right? In another world, these dudes would be in a segregated special education classroom with low expectations on them. And here they are running a computer software company whose clients are Microsoft and Intel, because the context has changed. And we have tremendous control over what we think of as normal, right? Based on the environment that we create. And investments in changing the context are investments that pay the most dividends and provide the most impact around social change. I'll give you another example of that, okay? About an investment in changing context. Not individuals, but context. That's an important difference, right? This was on the front page of the New York Times, and about a year ago. And it was an article about a school in the Twin Cities in Minnesota called Eden Prairie. It's a community outside of the Twin Cities. And there was an article about how in 1 year, this high school, public high school, had dramatic transformations in traditional test scores, in SAT scores, in attendance, in traffic accidents around the school. Literally, like, in 1 year, they had some dramatic gains. So the school was descended upon by researchers, right? And most of the researchers asked questions like, what reading program are they using? What new curriculum are they implementing? What's in the water of Eden Prairie? You know what I mean? Like, all these sort of research studies. And the research studies unanimously concluded that this profound academic and social change at this high school was attributed to one thing. Y'all know what it was? Eden Prairie High School started school 1 hour later. 1 hour later. The adolescent brain ain't ready to learn at 7:30 in the morning, right? It certainly ain't ready to drive a car to school at 7:30 in the morning, right? One of the most dangerous times in any community is when high schoolers are driving to school early in the morning. So again, a context change. They didn't run around and diagnose a bunch of kids there and do RTI. They didn't run around and invest in a set of interventions to fix kids. They made a profound context change, right? To what surrounded kids, And I think that is a research base for us to grow from. But the research base, frankly, is secondary to the experience base, to what each and every one of you know. You've seen the kid who goes to the art class or hands-on learning class and is the top of the class, and then you've seen the same kid go to the chalk and talk sit-still class and be the bottom of the class. And the kid is the same, what's different? What surrounds the kid, right? Y'all have seen it. So let's talk about where we can make some strategic changes to context, I think y'all are going to get a lot of really good information at this conference about things to do differently with children and to children. And I think that has a role to play. I think it's a little bit overblown and out of balance, but nonetheless I think it has a role to play. But for right now I want to talk about some places where you can make some significant impact by thinking about how we change the context of what surrounds kids. Some of this will not come as a surprise to you. And I'm really going to talk about 4 things, okay? 4 things. Number 1, you go back to school on Monday and you want to put a young person or a classroom full of young people on a different pathway. You get rid of the school desk. People think I'm saying that flippantly. I'm not at all. There is substantial research that movement is intrinsically linked to thinking and learning for all young people. If y'all need a source to either believe that statement and or get others to believe that statement, read a wonderful book by a good friend of mine named John Rady, and the book is called Spark, like spark plug, just spark. The Science of Movement. He's a Harvard psychiatrist. He co-authored Learning Outside the Line, Driven to Distraction. His name is John Rady, which I cannot spell for you. But if you Google Spark, like spark plug, the book will come up. It's available and accessible everywhere. He's a Harvard psychiatrist who surveys the literature in a comprehensive way about the validity of movement being linked to emotional well-being, to overall physical health, obviously, but most importantly, to learning, retention, and memory. It calls into question this idea that kids should be sitting still all day. And I think we all know that. There was a school in Wisconsin. Another one profiled on the front page of the New York Times that got rid of their desks. Not a hippy-dippy private school, not a progressive charter school, a everyday middle America public school. It was studied by the University of Wisconsin. They replaced their desks with workstations. Kid could stand at the workstation, sit at the workstation, or kneel at the workstation. Workstations could be combined or pulled apart. An interesting, little-known fact, the workstation cost as much as the traditional desk and chair. So this is not a money issue. This is a paradigm issue, right? Didn't cost any more money. And in 1 year, referrals for suspension and detention decreased 50% in that school, and their standardized test scores went up 30%, and the obesity rates of that school decreased by 25%. Right? We got a crisis in this country around obesity. We'll bankrupt this country. You know, it really will. And no one talks about the fact that kids sit still 8 hours a day, right? We have to rethink that desk. And we have to challenge that as the focal point of learning. And there's good research behind it, and there's simple ways to do it. Let me give you some of those simple ways to do it, right? We don't got to go as far as to rethinking the desk right off the bat. Just rethink the fidget and help teachers and kids not be ashamed of that and channel that in a productive way. You know, many of y'all here, I'm sure, use stress balls. That's a wonderful tool, right? You let a kid play with that, hold that, fidget with that. I've worked with teachers who's got that drummer, you know what I mean? Don't get me wrong. I teach in some way for a living, and if somebody's rocking the drums in the front row, you know what I mean? Got it. Distracting. Have that kid drum on their leg. Because the moment they drum on their leg, guess what? The noise is gone, right? I've worked with teachers who give every kid mouse pads, you know? Thick pieces of essentially like styrofoam, and they put it down. And kids drum all they want on that because it doesn't make a noise and bother other kids. Channel that fidget in a different way. Go further than that, though. You really need to encourage educators, and if you're a parent, to adopt this mentality yourself of what I started our morning with, which was not a joke, which is the average human attention span is 15 minutes. And young people need to take breaks between those content chunks. A break can be as simple as, hey guys, stand up, stretch, sit down. Done. How long did that take? That took us 30 seconds to do. A break for a kid like me can be as simple as I get to get up, I get to walk to the back of the room, throw something away, and come back. I don't know if we have pencils anymore in school. Do we have pencils? You know? I don't know why. I mean, I guess we do have spelling tests, even though we have spell checker. I understand that. But used to be, kids got yelled at for sharpening their pencils. So many kids were doing intentional breaks that way. Getting up, sharpening that pencil, sitting back down, right? Build in those intentional breaks. Now really go past that too and question the desk. Question the desk. I've worked with teachers who said kids shouldn't get one desk, they should get two. And they put them together. And a kid can get up and go from desk to desk to desk as much as they want, because when they get up and move, it clicks in that physical motor memory. I've worked with teachers who put a big circle around a desk in chalk or tape and said to a kid, you know what, you can do anything you want within this circle, right? Stand up, you know, walk around like this on your desk. The moment you go on the other side of the circle, you've passed the limit. there's consequences, but you can get up and move. I've worked with teachers who have gotten rid of the chair, kept the desk, but gotten rid of the chair and replaced it with exercise balls, right? Because a kid on an exercise ball can bounce, can fidget, it doesn't make as much noise as the chair, and let's be honest, you get a sweet ab workout at the same time, right? It is a win-win, you know? When I was in high school, I had a teacher named Mr. Starkey right here at Green Mountain, not far from where we're talking up in Lakewood. He told every kid, not just kids with labels, every kid in his class, that there's a clipboard station in the back. He had 15 clipboards. Didn't cost him a lot of money. Nailed them up there. Any kid could go get the clipboard, stand in the back of the classroom, and take notes standing up or pacing. That was open to anyone. They rethought the desk, right? If you want to make a profound difference in a kid's life, you do that on Monday. That is more important than any pedagogical technique you can adopt, any program you can adopt. It's a costless change that every one of us can make. We rethink the desk. Okay, so that's a real concrete place, right? We can make some context change. Number 2, it's not academic. But I think it's more important than any academic conversation. Can we take seriously the emotional violence, otherwise known as bullying, that's occurring to kids with cognitive and physical differences every single day at school? You know, you talk to many young people, and it ain't the reading out loud that they're most scared of, though they're terrified of that. And it ain't the hallway that they're most scared of, though they're terrified of that. It's the verbal abuse and humiliation that they face with their peers, right? And it is an epidemic. It really is. You know, I live in Santa Monica, and I live 4 blocks from the high school. And 2 weeks ago, a kid ran out of school, went to the top of a hotel across the high school, and jumped and died. Committed suicide. And had a history of being bullied because he was Asperger's and autism at school. For many young people, that is the most significant barrier for them in a school context. Now, I know I'm not saying anything new here in that respect. I think we all understand it's a problem. But what I want to encourage you is 3 things if you want to address that problem, okay? 3 things that I actually don't hear talked enough about. Number 1, it ain't kids being kids. It's a form of discrimination. And that language needs to be used. You know, I'd go out to the playground and I would hear, John, you're a retard, you're a spaz, you're a freak. Those, from my perspective, should be treated as the moral equivalent of a racial slur. No school district would tolerate those words that are off limits when it comes to other minorities on school grounds. But yet, on a daily basis, the word retard is used. On a daily basis. And administration hears it, and teachers hear it. It needs to be treated not as kids are kids, but as a form of discrimination. And we need to adopt that diversity paradigm, which moves, if you're a parent, bullying complaints into a whole nother world of litigation. It brings it into a civil rights issue, and it gives you as a parent a whole nother avenue to encourage and or pressure a school to take what is a form of discrimination very, very seriously. Number 2, if we want to really deal with bullying, and this is something I don't hear talked about, we have to understand, especially at the younger grades, that bullying is learned behavior, right? So let me give an example from my life that I talked about a moment ago or earlier this morning. Jonathan Mooney's foot's bouncing, right? And Mrs. C stops class and says, "What's your problem?" The next period at recess, guess what I hear from every kid out on the playground? What's your problem? It's modeled behavior. And something we're not talking enough about is some adults in schools bully kids. And we need to be honest about that. We really do, you know? And it's modeled behavior. And we need to address that. And we need to talk about that. And lastly, to go to a solution perspective, opposed to just identifying the problem perspective, there's a lot of hope and I think inspiration that can be gleaned from what the gay and lesbian community has done around this issue. And it's been in the news over the last couple months, the bullying around those specific minorities in schools. And there's a wonderful project that was organized online by a filmmaker called the It Gets Better Project, which is all about giving young people a message that it gets better to be somebody who has a different sexual orientation. And it's adults sharing their stories about it getting better for them. Again, that's connected to the community building piece here, but it helps a young person survive this if they know it gets better. I told you all that I dropped out of school in 6th grade. A big part of the catalyst to that was being bullied by another student in my school. And I left school and I had a plan for suicide. I was 12 years old. And literally, something similar to the It Gets Better, though it wasn't called that, saved my life. My mom brought home a videotape. It was an interview that she had taped on date the night before I left school. And the interview was with a young man who was 25 years old. He went to Yale Law School. But this young man at Yale Law could not read a word because he was dyslexic. And his mother read every one of his law books to him. That saved my life. That gave me hope. Now, I'll be honest with you, sucks to be the guy's mom, all right? Like, guy, ain't a hopeful message for you. Go get your law degree. I got that. I understand that. But that didn't matter to me. What mattered to me was there was a message of it gets better. It gets better. And as we think about bullying and mitigating that, because again, there are kids for whom school is easy. I mean, there are kids on the Asperger's continuum who are getting straight A's in gifted programs, right? And it's hell because of the way that they're treated by their peers. And to take that seriously requires us to adopt a diversity discrimination model. It requires us to understand that bullying is learned behavior, and there are adults in schools that bully young people. And it requires us to adopt a campaign that's analogous to the It Gets Better campaign in some way, shape, or form. And those are some ways for us to really move that context down the road and change that. So I said 4, remember? 4 ways we can kind of change a context, right? 1 is rethink that desk, make a profound difference. Number 2, talk seriously about the verbal and physical violence many young people face with cognitive and physical differences. Number 3. Now I'm going to go the other way. I'm going to get more academic here for a second, more practical when it comes to school. Can we really rethink the primacy that we have given reading and writing in our school settings as the intrinsic gatekeeper skills to a successful adult life? Now I'll be honest with you, if you would have a conversation with me in 1950, right, and you said, Jonathan, every kid needs to read and write, I'd say, right on, you are exactly right, right? Because to move forward in the world, that was, and those were necessary gatekeeper skills. But ain't 1950, you know what I mean? Anymore. It's 2011. And an individual, and this is a contentious thing to say, but I believe it deeply, an individual in today's world can live a meaningful and successful life being a non-reader and a non-writer, period. They can. That wasn't the case, but it is the case now. Now that's not to say that reading and writing don't cultivate important intellectual habits. That's not to say that. But if that's our goal with reading and writing, that's how we should sell it to kids. We should say, look, this activity will build important intellectual habits in your mind. I frankly believe that's true for me. I studied English literature at Brown. I write books. I make a living off of reading and writing. And it's helped me be a clear, concise thinker. No question about it. But I don't need it to get a job anymore. And I don't need it to be successful anymore. I have an iPhone in my pocket right now that can download 2 million books. That's this 5 minutes. Next 5 minutes, 4 million books. And after that, 10 million. There's a law going through Congress that would make every single textbook required to be digitally accessible, right? Any book at a college level or a secondary level would have to be downloadable to an MP3 player, to an iPhone, to an iPad. There are digital textbooks coming out right now called books, which are a merger of books and videos for iPads, where you can listen to the whole thing. There is movies built into the book itself. We are in a whole new world when it comes to what skills you need to access information. And the same goes with writing. You can download right now for 99 cents Dragon Naturally Speaking application for your iPhone. And you can dictate any email, any web search, any note, anything from your voice right to text. And that costs you $1, right? We are changing this. Now again, that's not to say that we shouldn't still cultivate these skills because they lead to good intellectual habits. They do. What it is to say is that if you have a young person struggling with these skills, the rest of their education shouldn't be cut off to them because they struggle with those skills. But that's what happens, right? What happens is Jonathan Mooney spends all day with C-Spot Run. When the reality is, if you gave me a book on tape, I'm going to hang out with whatever anyone else is reading and thrive in that context, right? So what I advocate for is a balance. I advocate a balance when a child is young on some specific research-based reading interventions and remediations. I think those have a place. That's balanced with me getting content at my intellectual level with these alternative technologies. But then I also advocate that as a kid gets older, and if the reading is still struggling, we move away from remediation and more to technology. If you got an 8-year-old, remediate away and use technology. You got an 18-year-old, on the remediation. Use the technology because you will be able to live a meaningful and a successful life as a non-reader and a non-writer in the 21st century today. So rethink those gatekeeper skills, right? And as we rethink the value or overvalue we've given reading and writing, we got to rethink some of these skills that we have undervalued, right? And this is what's interesting. I don't know if y'all read the New Yorker, but David Brooks, another person I'm not apt to quote all that often, right? Wrote an amazing article about how school misses the boat on a lot of the skills that actually matter in life success, right? And there's really two of them, right? We overvalue reading and writing thinking that's the platform to a successful life, and we undervalue two things. Number one, talking. Successful adults, one of the things they all have in common is verbal skills and verbal capacity. But unfortunately, we spend all of first grade telling kids to do what? Shh. And then we spend all of 8th grade yelling at them for not talking enough, right? You know? Why don't y'all participate more? Well, you told me to be quiet for 8 years, right? And we systemically and consistently shame and devalue verbal skills in our schools. We do. And there are drastic consequences for that because that's one of the most predictive skill set for life success. And number two, and this was in the New Yorker piece as well, the ability to work with others. The ability to work with others. You know, an information economy in which teams of people with specific skills, remember that specialist model, come together to move things forward, you have to be able to work with others. We don't value that. You know, the young woman who's a good network and relationship builder is derided as somebody who's off-task, social butterfly, right? Where the same skill set that young woman has in middle school can be channeled to the corporate world and they can make a whole career off of, right? Because that network building, that relationship building is important in working with others. We still treat kids when it comes to their grades as these silos. You got an A. When all of corporate work is about working as a team. I sat on a panel in New York about a month ago with executives from major media companies talking about what skill sets made them successful. And this one executive said the biggest challenge he had as he moved from a sort of worker to a manager was knowing how to work with others. Because he was told that you're an individual silo opposed to a member of a team. And that's something that we've done in school. So I think we need to rethink reading and writing as those core gatekeeper skills and rethink some of these skills that we've spent a lot of time devaluing. Now I got one more. Then we're going to take a quick break and then we're going to conclude. So context change, right? Context change to the desk, context change to the bullying, context change around the skills that we put as central to schooling. And last but not least, it seems somewhat minor kind of to end on, but I think it's important, to the way that we assess young people. You know? There's a symbiotic relationship between assessment and motivation. Let me explain that relationship through my own life, right? If I start a class, right, and I'm told, Jonathan, you got 3 books to read, which are going to be difficult for you in and of itself. And then, the way I'm going to evaluate you is to give you a paper and pencil test in which you have to write an essay in a timed setting. And your knowledge of these books is going to be assessed there. Why would I bother reading the books? Right? I mean, that's a logical conclusion for a young person, right? I have no chance of showing you what I know because I spell at a 3rd grade level, you can't read my handwriting, and I can hardly hold a pencil, right? Because that's my relationship to a paper and pencil test. Why would I spend all the energy to read the books in the first place, right? So there's a relationship between motivation and kids staying committed to doing the work and assessment, right? And the way that we assess young people. And I think we all are well aware of the sort of fallacy around this standardized assessment and how it's squeezed out so many other opportunities in school. But assessment, even before we get to the standardized nature of it, has other problems for kids like me, right? You give a timed test, right? The thing you are assessing is not how well I know it, but how fast I know it, right? And why does how fast I know it trump how well I know it? There's no good reason for that, right? Are we trying to create a generation of Jeopardy contestants, you know? Is Alex Trebek on the school board, right? I mean, there's no reason why time should matter most. There's an interesting paradox there if you study mathematicians, and I'm doing this for the new book about neurodiversity. Often those guys are the slowest in the work that they do, right? It's the complexity and the depth of their thought that matters, not the pace of their thought, right? And the same goes for a reading and writing test, right? You know, you give me a paper and pencil test, and I hear all the time from educators, and I believe this, and they say, look, I'm an expert in my content. I'm not here to teach reading and writing. And I say, right on, you're right. You know, you're a math teacher, you're a social studies teacher, beautiful. Unfortunately, when you give that paper and pencil test, the first thing you're assessing is, guess what? Reading and writing. You know what I mean? And so the idea that I'm going to assess content is totally negated by the fact that I'm assessing those skill sets first and foremost, right? So at Brown University, I was given oral exams. I was given project-based assessment. I was given time extensions on every single thing that I did because it opened up my capacity to show what I know. And that's an important change you can make to the context that surrounds kids. So, again, you look at my life, right? I'm the same guy. I'm the same guy that was in the hallway, and then I'm at Brown. What changed? Not me, but the context changed. A lot of people thought I was cured of my dyslexia when I went to Brown. Literally, people said that to me. They said, you are cured, right? No, let me give you an example of how uncured I was when I got to Brown University, right? My first class ever at Brown was in organic chemistry, okay? Organic chemistry. But I confused words that look alike, so I wrote my first Ivy League paper on, of all things, orgasmic chemistry, okay? Yeah. I was not cured. I got an A+, by the way, but that's a different story. No. I didn't change. What surrounded me changed. And that's the most important investment that you can make. As a parent, as a professional, as a teacher, as an administrator. To ask yourself, how can we change what surrounds kids? I think an important part of the day where we talk together a little bit. But I did want to sort of bring some of the conversation today to a conclusion. And I wanted to bring some really interesting research that's happening that I think is really changing the way that we think about folks with cognitive and physical differences. And I wanted to do that for about 20 minutes or so, and then There's a formal break in which they have some refreshments that goes until 2:45. And then I'd ask you all to be promptly back here at 2:45 so we can really have an hour, because I do need to leave at 3:45, an hour for some dialogue. So that's where we are in our day. And here we go. You know, I think the way to end this conversation is through a story that really comes from Project Eye to Eye. And I think it really encapsulates what a neurodiversity framework is all about. Because that's kind of what we were exploring today, right? Through the guise of my story and lens of my story, about how a shift from seeing me as broken and defective to somebody who embodies a particular facet of human diversity can change a life. But one of the problems with making that shift is it runs right smack into a deeply held belief that there's a normal that we all should aspire to. That there is a normal human mind, human brain, human body. That's really the foundation of a deficit model, right? You know, here's the norm, you're not it, something's wrong with you. And that idea of a normal is really powerful. It's powerful in our language, in the way that we think about ourselves, in the way that we think about others. And today, and a lot of what we talked about was really at its core about challenging that myth, that there is a normal, and about questioning it. And I want to share with you a profound experience I had with how questioning normal and the validity of it can fundamentally change a kid's life. And this experience came, as I mentioned, from Project Eye to Eye. I spoke briefly about Eye to Eye as a mentoring and community building initiative that essentially brings adults with cognitive and physical differences into the lives of young people who have similar experiences. Not as tutors, but as mentors, as folks who can inspire a young person to have a different sense of what their future could be and a different sense of themselves in the present. So Project Eye to Eye is all around the country. We have a wonderful chapter here in Denver, Denver University, and a local school. And if you're interested in getting involved in it, my email is a good place to hit me up about that. If you're interested in starting one, another good way to utilize that email is to write me about that. Because it's easy to do. Requires very little financing, and it's just about the will to build these mentoring networks. But when we started Project Eye to Eye, and my profound experience in challenging normal comes from this first experience with Eye to Eye, we didn't have 30 chapters in 30 states. We didn't have 30 people. We had 5 Brown students, 5 third graders, who met in a special ed room at a school called the Fox Point Elementary School in the south side of Providence, Rhode Island. And I was one of those 5. My co-author and best friend at the time, David Cole, was another one of those 5. And then there were a couple other folks. But the person who I want to tell you about was one of these mentors named Kent Roberts, okay? And Kent Roberts was, in the best sense of this term, a complete freak show, okay? And I mean that as a compliment, right? Let me give you an idea of how eccentric Kent Roberts was and still is. We're still good friends. When I met Kent Roberts to interview him for the position at Project Eye to Eye, he showed up with a long beard down to his waist, long hair down to his waist. He totally looked like Jesus, right? A dead ringer for Jesus. So I'm having an interview with Kent Roberts, and I ask him, Kent, what makes you qualified to be a mentor of a young child? Standard question we ask anyone before they become mentors. And Kent Roberts proceeded to tell me that what qualified him for this job was the fact that when he was in 8th grade, he decided he would stand up in class every day at 10 a.m. and yell surprise for 1 minute. Every day for 1 year, Kent Roberts yelled surprise. And that qualified him to inspire a person in his mind, right? I went further and said, okay, Kent, that's interesting. What else qualifies you to inspire a young person? And he proceeded to tell me that when he was 16, he got a perfect score in his SAT. 100%. He's on the Asperger's ADHD sort of world over there. And he was recruited to leave high school and go to Harvard University early. And he was flown from his small Indiana town to Harvard. And he had an interview with the Dean of Admissions at Harvard University. And Kent Roberts showed up to this interview, and he was nicely dressed. And he engaged in polite conversation with this dean. And then 10 minutes into the interview with the Dean of Admissions at Harvard University, Kent Roberts pretended that his head caught on fire. Oh my God. And he ran around the room, and he rolled on the floor, and he doused himself with a bottle of water, and then returned to the interview as if nothing had happened, okay? And that was the second qualification that Kent had to mentor a child. And so I hired him, right? What else would you do? I will be the first to admit that it was suspect judgment on my part to bring Kent into the life of a child, but no one else applied for the job, right? So it was me, Dave Cole, Kent Roberts, and one other dude, and we rolled to the first day of Project I, first day, and we met 5 young people, and we were each paired up, and we went over and we shared our stories. We really didn't know what we were doing. And halfway through the session, whatever you want to call it, I hear Kent Roberts screaming at the top of his lungs at the young person he's mentoring. And his mentee is a young man named Philip. And Philip is a hurting kid. He has school phobia, hides under his bed in the morning. He is so anxious about school that when we met him, he had no left eyebrow because he rubbed his whole left eyebrow raw, an anxiety tick. Hurting kid. And about halfway through the session, I hear Kent Roberts screaming at Philip at the top of his lungs. And he's screaming, Philip, if you learn one thing in Project Eye to Eye, you have to learn that normal people suck, Philip. They suck. Like, that is not what Jesus says, man. I mean, come on now. I am in a public elementary school. I think the cops are coming next, right? I wanted to do Project Eye to Eye as my profession upon graduation, and I'll tell you right now, there is absolutely no federal grant money for an organization whose mission is to curse at children, okay? There's no money for that. So I go home that night, and I am furious at Kent Roberts. I think he has ruined Project Eye to Eye. So I call the guy on the phone, and I yell at him. I yell at Kent for about 10 minutes. Why did you say that? What were you thinking? How could you say that? Kent doesn't say a word until the very end. All he says is, it's true, and hangs up the phone, right? That's it. So I'm thinking just maybe, water under the bridge, right? You know, no teacher heard it. No principal was present, you know. Right under the rug, right? No, wrong. Next morning at 8:30 in the morning, I get a call at my dorm room from Principal Mary Brennan, the principal of the Fox Point Elementary School. And she respectfully summons me to her office to discuss what transpired the day before Project Eye to Eye. So I drive to the school, and I'm thinking in my head of all the ways I can apologize for scarring this third grader, right? And to confirm my fears, when I get to the principal's office, not only is it Principal Mary Brennan, but it's also Philip's grandmother. Because Philip lives full-time with Grandma. And if I've learned one thing in my brief life, it is do not mess with Grandma, right? Don't do it. Don't go there, right? Because before I can even sit down, Philip's grandmother, she stands up and she points at me and she says, "What did you do to my grandson? I said, nothing. It was that Kent guy, you know? Do a thing. She looked at me, and she had tears in her eyes. And she said, Jonathan, for 3 years, my grandsons hid under the bed before school. For 3 years, from our home to school, my grandson's been in tears, begging me to go back. But today, the day after Project Eye to Eye, my grandson was up early, waiting in the car, ready to go to school. What the hell did you do to my grandson? I looked at her and I said, well, it was my good friend, Kent Roberts, right? And it's true. It wasn't me. Nope. It was really Kent. Because for the first time in Philip's life, somebody said to him, not me, but Kent, you're not broken. What's broken is the myth of normal. That's what's broken. And that had a transformative impact on Philip's life. Changed his life. That was 15 years ago. We've been in touch with Philip ever since that first day of mentoring as an organization, and he's in college now. And he wrote his college application essay about Kent Roberts. About that moment and what it meant to him. Because the idea that there's a normal we all should aspire to is a tyrannical idea. And it's a fictional idea. It's a myth. There's a great saying, which is the only normal people are people you don't know very well, right? That the moment we enter a relationship with another human being, we realize that it's our differences that make us unique. Our eccentricities, our deficits that constitute our humanity. And that's the inside of a neurodiversity framework, is that there is no normal brain, right? That difference, paradoxically, is normal. And all of the brain research is showing that these brains and these people shouldn't just be included because it's an ethical thing to do. They should be included and celebrated because these brains are valuable to human society, right? That they're an intrinsic part of what makes us human. You know, there's amazing research that shows that while the ADHD, Asperger's, dyslexic, these brains have significant deficits in certain parts of the brain, that the brain is such a plastic and elastic organism, it compensates for those deficits and gets larger elsewhere. So these young people have strengths not despite their challenges, but guess what? Because of their challenges. That's the paradigm of the 21st century when it comes to the brain. And when it comes to research about folks like me. It's not a despite anymore, it's a because model. And when we understand that, we can understand the paradox that there's a correlation between neurodiversity and creativity, right? There's a study that shows that art colleges in America, like the Rhode Island School of Design, 50% of students that go to those colleges have some sort of neurodiversity. Almost half. There's a correlation between neurodiversity and innovation, right? 30% of MIT has ADHD according to a dean there, and the other 70% has Asperger's, right? There's a direct correlation there. And there's a correlation between neurodiversity and entrepreneurship. On the front page of the New York Times business section, 40% of entrepreneurs in America, 40%, have dyslexia or another language-based learning disability. That is staggering. And it's the entrepreneurs, the innovators, the creative thinkers that are going to drive this country forward in the 21st century. We need an innovation economy, and it's these brains that can drive an innovation economy. So these people, these brains are valuable not despite their challenges, they're valuable because of their challenges.
Hypothyroidism, and it's a calcium problem. And
Yeah.
what happens in your cognition basically leaves when our calcium goes down. And she's in college, and she's really struggling with how to get her professors to listen to her as an advocate. I mean, she can ask them for things, but did you have some kind of a plan that you went in with, or how did you get your assistant? Because she's going to feel like she's getting
shafted.
Yeah.
Just call it what it is. And what's your name?
My name's Michelle.
Michelle, right on. And where are you from, Michelle?
I'm from Douglas, Wyoming.
Douglas, Wyoming. Okay. Beautiful state. So it's kind of a weird room. So I think I probably will just reiterate folks' questions to make sure everyone's on the same page in terms of making sure you can hear me in the back. In terms of, I meant weird space-wise, okay? Yeah. Probably otherwise as well, but that wasn't my intention. But neurodiverse, right? So I was asked a wonderful question around, like, did I have any strategies to be an advocate in a post-secondary setting and to work with teachers, faculty members in that setting to sort of get my needs met. And Michelle shared a story of her friend who had a particular disability that needed some fairly minor accommodations, I imagine, all right, and probably access to food consistently was what she needed, among other things, but nonetheless it wasn't a big, like, rebuild a building, you know what I mean, or something like that. And I'm always interested in the way that, and this is actually a research study, that something like 95% of the accommodations that folks ask for and use are costless accommodations. Literally. Some of them are actually less expensive, and they save districts money. So anytime I talk about accommodation modification, I like to put out that the vast majority of the time it's a paradigm issue opposed to a cost issue. And that's important to understand. Because what that means is that you're trying to change people's view, and you're trying to change their minds. So I, as an advocate for myself, I always ask myself, what are the ways to help people change their minds? Because that's really what you want them to do. And I think there were a couple important strategies that I used, okay? Number one, one of the challenges, I think, for parents being advocates, young people being advocates for themselves, is we tend to engage in the advocacy process when there's a problem. When the reality is you should engage with the advocacy process before there's a problem, right? Because the moment you're engaged in a problem context, you got two people on two sides, right? Like, hey, I didn't do well on this test, I want to retake it. Well, no, you shouldn't. You know, I mean, you're already in a place of antagonism, right? So your timing of your advocacy matters a tremendous amount. And if you look at a lot of young folks in post-secondary education, if you look at the research, they don't start advocating until they start failing. That's just the way it goes. And if you want to be more effective as somebody to get your needs met, you don't go when you're failing, you go before that starts. And that sounds like a simple thing to say, but it's something that we often miss. Now, connected to that is my second piece of advice, which is that you want to build a relationship with somebody. I mean, that is the way to have somebody see you differently. So I made it a point that every single class I had, I went to office hours before the class started. I went to office hours every week. I was the person who the faculty member knew by name because I made a pointed attempt to build a relationship. Because the reality is, we do things for people that we're in relationships with that we wouldn't otherwise do for somebody who is a stranger. That's just the reality of being human. And again, I think that a lot of students sort of take heart in the letter, right? Hey, I have a letter saying I'm worthy of accommodations. And look, yeah, technically, that does require a system to act and behave differently. But somebody's much more likely to make an accommodation, even if they're legally mandated, for a person opposed to a piece of paper. And that's really important. And that brings me to my third point. Outside of the advice that I would give to an individual. And so my advice is go early before problems arise and build a relationship. And that's a way for you to be a better advocate. But my third piece of advice is outside of individuals, more global. And that's if you want to change the culture of a institution to be more accommodating, if you have a systems change, you should lead not with facts and law, but with stories. And that's a big mistake that we make sometimes. We get up there and we say, well, the ADA requires this, or the IDA requires this, or here's a fact about 95% of accommodations not costing money. You know, we lead with these abstractions when the reality is you want people to see the people behind the label, right? So Brown University is a really interesting example of that. So Brown is accommodating for a variety of reasons. Partly to do with their academic culture, which I think is an important point I may come back to later. But what's relevant to this conversation is Brown is accommodating because in the 1980s, they organized a group of Brown students with disabilities to go to each faculty department and share their stories. You know, and informally, you know, group of 5 people share their stories about a building not being accessible, about being dyslexic on campus, and they spent a year with this rotating group of Brown students sharing their stories to faculty members, and it created a very accommodating, inclusive environment because it ceased to be an abstraction like a learning disability and it became a person. And that's the most important work you can do in sort of systems change around an issue like accommodation and modification. So those are 3 things I'd keep in mind. 2, I think, are directly relevant to an individual, but then the third is something that we would sort of take up as folks who are concerned with creating a more accommodating environment. So thank you. Question in the way back.
You mentioned the counselor that kept telling you that you weren't going to be anything more than flipping burgers and never be a success. That was up here.
Yeah.
Did you ever go back to him and give him some of your books?
It's an important question. And what's your name?
Cheryl.
Cheryl, I know we chatted in the break. You'll bear with me about the names. Dyslexia is kind of hard around that. That individual, I did not have an opportunity to come in beyond my own experience, and the satisfaction of that. It's unfortunate because I was not the only one who was given those expectations. It is a pattern. So it would have been important for me to have that opportunity so that others didn't go through it. That gentleman retired and was no longer a part of the system, so we lost touch. But I do want to share one thing in this vein, because I do think it's very important, as I mentioned in my talk, for folks to try to dedicate their life to proving people wrong and to getting an us versus them mentality and using that as a catalyst for change, because it's a very powerful catalyst. But I want to share a different story which I think is hopeful for another reason. So I went to Green Mountain High School, and I had 2 polar experiences with what is a deep passion for me, and that's literature and stories. And what's interesting about these polar experiences is that the 2 teachers were married. You know what I mean? Husband and wife, which is always very interesting. Mr. Starkey and Mrs. Starkey. And Mr. Starkey was this amazing, transformative educator. And Mrs. Starkey was, let's just say, not that. Okay? And I was invited to a conference in Cherry Creek some time ago, which is right down the road. And a twice exceptional conference to share my journey and my experience. And I talked about Mr. and Mrs. Starkey in the context of how much context matters, right? Same coursework, essentially, married teachers, and I get an A and an F. You know what I mean? And guess who's in the audience? Mrs. Starkey. God bless her. And to her credit, afterwards, she came right up and apologized. And said, I didn't know. And I made a mistake. And many mistakes. And I'm sorry for that. And I say that that matters a lot because I really do believe, and I think I have to believe this, that people act 95% of the time out of ignorance and not malice. Right? And that means the more we can share stories and humanize an issue, and the more that we can build those bridges and address the ignorance, there's hope for a lot of change. Now, there's still the 5%, right? And that's important to acknowledge too. Because as a parent or an individual, when you're in front of the 5%, you cut your losses and you do something else. And that's a very important to acknowledge and be real about too. Because no matter how much you narrate and tell the story, no matter how many facts and figures you put in front of the 5%, it ain't going to change, right? And that's an important thing to understand as you try to navigate this world. You know, accept those things you cannot change the things you can, and have the wisdom to know the difference, right? And that's an important framework. But Mrs. Stark taught me that there is 95%, and there are folks who are open to change. And something else that I really learned from Mrs. Starkey, and I subsequently have seen it elsewhere, is that so many of that 95% were not prepared by their own education to do right by young people, and or are not being supported by the current administration and current folks in their school to do them right by young people. And I really see a synergy between Mrs. Starkey and me, in the sense that, and teachers and me, I see a common ground, which is we're both stuck in a system in which we are forced to fail. And more so now than ever, around the teachers, you know. I know so many brilliant teachers who say, look, you know, I'm on the same page as you and all the folks who talk like you, but what am I going to do? If scores don't increase 10%, I'm fired. I mean, and that's the world we're going to, or the world we're in. And so it's hopeful to me that the origin of the behavior isn't malice, but it means we have a lot of work in front of us if teachers are feeling as disempowered as young people in a school system. And I think they are. And I think they're being demonized and shamed in very comparable ways that young people have historically been demonized and shamed. I think educators are going through the same thing. And we're going to lose so many gifted educators because of that. You know, in California, there's a perfect storm. 100,000 new teachers will be required to replace retirements in California in the next 10 years. Teachers are getting pink slips and being laid off, even though the long-term trajectory is one of growth. And young people are discouraged from entering the profession because their name may show up on the LA Times as one of the ineffective teachers. And they're being demonized by movies like Waiting for Superman and whatnot. And they're not going into the field. What are we going to have left? And that's a real challenge that we as a community of folks who care about education have to take seriously. So I appreciate that. Rebecca, please.
Well, I have a question related to the adults bullying the kids.
Yeah.
I understood you touching upon the topic of the emotional bullying and the modeling. I get that. But also in the state of Colorado, and you know, and this is conversations I had with peak parents, you know, and also with attorneys, you know, saying there's really horrific cases in the state of Colorado, and the legal center here, which is our legal center for disabilities, is like so completely overwhelmed that even a tough case where a child is actually physically assaulted and there's, you know, criminal charges been filed by the police, I mean, and the DAs are handling it, like the legal center can't even help us. So I'm trying to formulate my question, but what is it that we can do to really be a catalyst in a powerful way? Because, well, for example, I read in 2 school districts, I actually read the policies that they have, because their policies are online. So if it's student-to-student violence, they've got a policy. If it's student to a teacher, like the student's the aggressor, there's a policy. But I could not find any policies online. Maybe they're trying to hide them from the internet, but I could not find where it's a teacher to a student.
Yep.
So that is really concerning, where these are two districts I know for a fact has got a bundle of problems. And if I had more time, I'm sure I'd find it consistent throughout the state.
Yeah.
So what can we do when we've got such an epidemic problem, I'm sorry to admit it, in Colorado, to make something better where, I don't know what it is, are the teachers just getting so stressed out that they're taking it out on the kids, is it the stress from the school or just stress from their own personal life? I don't know what to do with it. I'm really concerned about it, and I'm not going to somebody else fix it. I want to be a part of the solution. So I'm grateful for some direction.
Yeah, great, important question, Rebecca. So, right on. Yeah. A few thoughts come to mind with that. I think you eloquently identified what often is an untold story, but according to statistics is a common story, which is and this actually went through litigation in New York State, and there may be some lessons there, but physical violence perpetuated amongst people with disabilities in special education system is disproportionate to other settings within schools. And that's been documented in a number of different legal challenges and subsequent rulings. So that's important to name and be honest about. Now, the roots of that, I think, are multifaceted and complex, as Rebecca identified. I think there are many folks who are overwhelmed and unprepared to work in these settings and defer to behavior modification strategies that are too aggressive because they haven't been appropriately trained. In many states, California being one of them, special education is a high needs area. They have an emergency credential option to place folks who haven't necessarily spent a lot of time with young people into those settings because they need bodies. And to go back to the emerging teacher crisis, that's where we're going to be again. We're going to be again in emergency credential place where the most at risk and high needs kids in low income schools and kids with disabilities have the least experienced educators. And that's stressful. I mean, I'm not condoning that some educators do go to the place of inappropriate physical behavior, but it is stressful to be dropped in a room unprepared. That doesn't condone it, but it does identify what is a core root of that. So I think we can't divorce the conversation around adequate preparation, reform of teacher credential and preparation, and some of those issues that you identified. Number two, I can tell you, kind of the antithesis of being unprepared, there are sort of sanctioned behavior modification programs that borderline on abuse. There are. That people sell and train in, and that some districts adopt and train their staff in. There are. Those exist. So that's the opposite problem, which is the staff has been trained in a particular methodology that either goes right to the line or, if misapplied, out of context, goes over the line. So I would look really carefully at that. I would look really carefully not only at where folks are being unprepared, but how are they being misprepared through a set of training. And I think that occurs a lot with folks, young people who are being trained in working with conduct disorders, trainings around emotional disorders, ED, and trainings around Asperger's autism spectrum when they're trying to do behavior modification work. And there's some scary stuff out there when it comes to that. Let's be honest. That's fully sanctioned, and districts buy to have people trained in. So I would look really clearly and closely at that as well. And then I think in some respects, Rebecca, you answered your own question about where you can really go, which is asking for, which is public information, the policies around this within districts. And that is a required disclosed document. They got to have those policies. And if those policies aren't in place, developing and working with the school to articulate what those policies would be. Because as you rightfully said, they're often student to student, student to teacher, but not the other way around in terms of articulating that and really looking at that. So I would really push on that as an avenue to move forward. And then I will just reiterate one more thing that I think is relevant here that I said in the overarching conversation around this, which is framing this in a diversity minority framework that has civil rights implications is a place that opens up more avenues for grievances and, frankly, litigation. And that's important. It's an important story to tell. It's interesting that the U.S. Office of Education, U.S. Department of Education, has a essentially discriminations office that looks at race discrimination around schools, etc. And historically, disability discrimination has not been something that they have vigorously looked at. Though other minority groups have representation as they should. So again, that's an advocacy agenda, and I've had some opportunity to speak with folks in the U.S. Department of Education on that issue. But it is an advocacy agenda to include that in their inquiries and in their scope of work and in what they see as their dominion. So those are some of my thoughts around a really important issue and challenging issue. Please.
What are your thoughts on stimulant medication and other medications used for individuals with ADHD?
What are my thoughts on medication? And you asked around stimulant medication, but we'll go with the big net on this one, which is medication writ large. So let me give you my thoughts on that. And my thoughts, to be honest, I think it's important to be honest, have been an involving and moving target. And let me give you a little idea of the breadth of that floating. And then I'll tell you where I'm at. It's ranged from absolutely to absolutely not, to right down the middle, to this much towards absolutely not, but still in the middle a little bit. And that's where I am today. So let me explain that in a more clear way, because that was clear, wasn't it? I mean, like, y'all good. You took notes, copious notes. I answered your question, and we're done. Let me explain what that sort of gray tilting towards concerned. Let me explain what that means, and there, okay? So, and hopefully provide some frameworks to think this through. So, let me tell you what tips me more to the concerned and share those with you. And these are things I think we really need to keep in mind. One, we look towards medication as a first response opposed to a last response, just as a culture. And no genuine professional would say that that's how you should approach this. It is a tool, but often the last tool in the toolbox to be utilized. But that's not how it's utilized. Kid can't sit still. Opposed to looking at all those things we can do that don't cost money, we get them a prescription of Ritalin. And that's our response. And I'm gravely concerned about that. Number two, in the concerned category, Ritalin was approved by the FDA after a 90-day trial. Not a 9-year trial in which many young people are using it lifelong. We are in unknown territory there. If anyone tells you we're not, they're being disingenuous. We're in unknown. I'm not claiming that there are known long-term side effects, but you cannot claim that there aren't. We're in unknown territory. Somebody using a medication that was approved after a 90-day trial for 10 years is in unknown territory. And I think we need to be honest about that. For both stimulant-based medication and a number of of mood-based medications and anxiety, etc., etc. And that's concerning. Third concern. Hit me into the concern. Ritalin was approved after a 90-day trial in isolation, not with Paxil and Zoloft and Thorazine together. And we are in the age of ever-expanding medication combinations, often prescribed to mitigate the side effects of another medication. And that is unknown territory. Again, I'm not claiming that there are known risks there, but anyone that claims that there are unequivocally no risks there is not being genuine with you. Is not being genuine with you. So those are real concerns for me. The latter two, which are unknowns, are real concerns for me. Now, one could hear those concerns and say, well, Jonathan, why doesn't that tip you all the way over into the absolutely not territory? And the reason that I don't tip into that territory is that there is solid, as I'm sure there is in this room, personal anecdotal evidence to the efficacy of a number of different medications. And there's research around the efficacy of a number of different medications. And that should be taken seriously. So what's emerged for me as a helpful way to think this through is that medication, and this is really where the research is going, can be an effective tool in certain contexts in combination with other interventions, but not a lifelong strategy. And that's really a helpful way to think about it. So I'll give you my buddy David Cole as an example, Running Outside the Lines with. He used Ritalin and other stimulant-based medications to get through Brown University. He's an artist. He doesn't do the math class well, so he needed that. But upon graduating from Brown, he became a professional artist, lives in New York City. No more medication. Because the context of his life has changed dramatically, right? So I think that's something really important to think about. To think about it as a tool that's used in the context of other tools and is used only within certain environments and situations. And the reality is, if folks are honest about their use of stimulant-based medication, you'll often hear that they're doing that intuitively, right? They're using it in that way intuitively, right? I talk with a lot of college students who use it around finals time, but not afterwards, right? I work with a lot of professionals who use it right around a project due date when they need to be focused, but when they're doing creative brainstorming, they don't. So there's a lot of folks using it in an episodic, contextual way like that. And I think that that's an appropriate and important way to think about it. Because it is disingenuous for me to negate people's personal experience where they say it's been effective, and it's disingenuous for me to negate the research. But I think that that tool metaphor is very important because it forces us to move away from the correlation between label and prescription. Meaning, often we say, you're labeled ADD, therefore you must be on this. Or you're labeled somebody with depression, you must be on this. Let's think about it like any other tool. You evaluate the efficacy of a tool based on whether it works or not. Does it get the job done, right? And that's something I would take seriously. If a young person's labeled ADHD and this doesn't do anything for them, in fact, it makes them feel worse, don't use that tool. But if a young person has ADHD and the tool works in their life, then invest in that. And I think that's a clear-minded way to think this through. But to go back to the concerned category, there's no way that around the fact that too many young people are using too many different types of medications in an inappropriate and unprofessional way. And we have to take that serious. So I think my explication makes my sort of drifting a little clearer, right? It's gray. It's highly contextual. It's done with some significant caveats, but those caveats don't unequivocally negate the fact that for some folks, it can be an effective tool that moves their lives forward. So, thank you. Please.
building a community
Yeah.
to ask people to go further when it's developmentally appropriate and talk about different things.
Yeah. Yeah, and we talked briefly about the break, so thanks for bringing that back up, because I'm sure it's a question and thought in people's minds here in the bigger group. I want to broaden your question from, how early is it to start building community, to, I think, a related question, which is how early is it to start a dialogue with young people around this, whether your interest is community building or advocacy development, etc., etc. How early do we start this dialogue, and how do we do it, right? Mm-hmm. So let me start with the last part of that question. How do we do it? Because I do think that our approach around this matters a lot. What do we say to kids? And often people hear my presentation and they take from it, and I'm not going to say it's a mishearing because I think there's a part of it, they take from it the idea that I'm against labels, and they extrapolate from that a kid should never be told that they're dyslexic or ADHD. And I think the idea that I'm concerned about labeling is an appropriate take-home from my presentation. But I want to address that for a second, because I do think that these categories are useful in the right context. So let me tell you what that context would be, and probably will be, when I talk to my children about these issues. Because let's not lie, right? The fruit does not fall far from the tree, Like, if y'all want to solve the energy crisis, come to my house, okay? Put them on a treadmill or a windmill and you have an alternative fuel, Like, it's no joke, Like, let's use it because I'm going to be there with y'all shortly, I know it. So how would I talk about it? Well, this is how I talk about it, right? First of all, it is infinitely better to be dyslexic or ADHD than stupid or crazy. That's progress, And I really think that's important, It's important to say to a kid, we got a name for why your brain struggles with reading. We got a name for it, and it's not stupidity. We got a name for why you struggle in the way you do with sitting still, and it's not that you're bad. That's progress. And I think that progress can occur early as the phenomenons are presenting themselves and the understanding of them as falling into those categories of dyslexia, ADHD emerge. If it's kindergarten, it's kindergarten. I believe that. I really do. Now, unfortunately, that's where the conversation usually ends. And that's just the beginning of the conversation. So what we say now is the story of dyslexia, ADHD, Asperger's, autism, whatever you're dealing with, is pretty complex. And usually the story we tell is not. You don't read well. You can't sit still. That's a part of the story. Right on. Bring up the brain scans. You can show it. Your brain was not built to read. Let's check that out. Okay? Right on. However, and this is where we ended our talk with, your brain does a whole host of other things that the other kids' brains don't do so well. And you tell that part of the story. And then there's another step. And the step is, and school, and this is the important part, and the world wasn't built for you. That's true. Again, not malicious. It's hard to build a system for all the differences that we have. And you're going to struggle, or you are struggling there, not because something's wrong with you, but because there's a mismatch between your brain and the environment. And the way that we reconcile that mismatch is to adopt a set of strategies, like accommodations, like reading programs, whatever those strategies are, to bridge the difference. And that's a very important way to present accommodations, because accommodations are usually presented as a way for a kid to get around their problem, opposed to a way for the environment to solve their problem, right? And that's how I would frame this to a kid. And I would frame it to a young person as early as the sort of symptoms and or phenomena be understood as dyslexia, ADHD, Asperger's, etc. If that's preschool, that's preschool. Talk about it. Have an honest conversation about it. Kids know more than you think they know and can understand more than we give them credit for. And then the community building piece, I would start as early as you can. You got a group of young people with diagnosed cognitive differences. You've had that conversation. There's no reason why we can't be watching my video, can't be sharing Project I e-mentors. There's no reason. Can't be bringing in high school students to work with first graders and share their stories. Now you have to work on language. I would be much more practical, not talk about dyslexia per se, but talk about reading out and the struggle with that. You know, how you kind of build community, and the strategies are a little different. They're much more storytelling oriented, but nonetheless, I think you can start that early. And I encourage you to do that early and often. So thank you. Let's do a time check. We got about 10 minutes or so, 15 minutes or so. So 3 or 4 more. Yeah, I thought I saw your hand up there too, man. I didn't want to miss you.
Yes, of course. I'd like to ask you a really quick question. If you let's see. What would be the percentage of people that read and write?
What would be the percentage of people who read and write, who sort of have that reading brain?
Yes.
And can do it naturally and fluently? That's a cool question. Cool question. So asked up front was, and it was asked by Ricky, what's like, how normal is that reading and writing brain? And that's what percent of folks can kind of do it naturally. And that's a cool question. So the way to understand that, I think, is for me to reiterate what I said in the big talk, which is this brain was never wired for reading. It wasn't. If you go back to the history of Western thought, Socrates believed that reading was the death of human culture. And writing was the death of human culture, because oral communication and memory would die based on that. And there was a long-standing debate between sort of his theories and Plato's theories, who felt that it was an advancement of human culture. And we've had to work really hard at getting a reading brain. And so statistically, you know, reading challenges like dyslexia and other specific learning disabilities occur as high as 25% of the population. So that means that about 25% or a quarter of us, we can't develop that reading brain, or develop a reading brain that does it with as much fluency and ease as the others. But with that said, even within the 75% who can acquire this, there's great variation to how well they do it and how much mastery. So 25% of folks aren't going to get there like me, or going to get there with a lot of struggle. And the rest are going to get there to varying degrees of success. But that doesn't mean that they're the normal brain and 25% are the abnormal brain. It means that there's a continuum, and we're all on some spot on that continuum about how well we can adopt our brain to reading. Now, what's also interesting, though, about understanding how the reading brain is not normal, not natural in that respect. And this is really the point of Marianne Wolf's work, and it's a cool book if you don't know it. I was talking at lunch with somebody about it. It's called Proust and the Squid, or The Squid and Proust, one or the other. Appropriate that I'm flipping them back and forth, so you'll find it if you look that way. Proust and the Squid. It's Marianne Wolf out of Tufts University. What's interesting is she extrapolates from the research that the reading brain isn't natural. She extrapolates from that the reading brain is no longer inevitable either. And that the digital brain and the visual brain, as our culture changes its mode of communication, will become the dominant brain. And that 25% of folks who don't have the reading brain, tables may be turned now. And they, because they don't read well, but they see well visually, they'll have a neurological predisposition to be more successful in this image culture. And those folks who adapted the reading brain easily may struggle. And so we may have a day in which the special education rooms are filled with readers, right? And the honors class are filled with us non-readers. And we'll have to develop empathy for them, Ricky. We will. Have to treat them with compassion and accommodate their difference, right? So I look forward to that day. Good question, brother. Thank you, man. I appreciate it. Yeah, got some more time. Yeah, in the back, please.
I noticed that you hold a cup when you are speaking.
Yes.
Is that a strategy?
It's this is I live at about 4 feet above sea level, and I don't want to lose my voice in the great city of Denver, Colorado, Mile High City. It's dry, so this is a not losing the voice strategy. But I adopt many of those things that you mentioned in general in my daily life. Could be cup, could be pen, could be something along those lines, and that is a big part of what I do, and it's related to that set of intermediary ideas that we can implement to help kids sort of channel that energy in a more effective way. And if we're an educator, not shame it, but give an outlet for it. So appreciate it. Please.
I have a son with ADHD, and I have a hard time motivating him because punishment or rewards doesn't work. So, what other intrinsically motivations do you think that work?
How do we motivate that intrinsically motivated person? And it was shared up front that the reward punishment model doesn't really work with her son. Well, I think first of all, I would just reiterate what are the motivational drivers for somebody who's intrinsically motivated. And those, as I mentioned in the body of my talk, are autonomy, mastery, and purpose, right? So what that means is as you think about motivating them, you want to align the environment around those drivers. And unfortunately, what that means is that you may have to come to accept that there will be many places in the child or young adult's life where they are unmotivated. That's what's interesting to me. Can we do a nice little dance here and say, look, can you bring autonomy into math class even though a kid isn't really interested in math class? Yeah, you can. And I think you should think about that, right? I think you should think about if you're doing something that's traditionally not motivating, bringing independent work into it, right? Because autonomous people like that. Choice into it, right? So you have 5 projects to choose from, you get to choose. Mastery into it, meaning you bring a game mentality into that class. Those are all things you can do.